If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button as well as the bell to be notified of future videos. Thank you.
Hello Internet, we are back. I'm excited. I've been waiting for this recording. I can tell you, I've been studying this fellow. He's a remarkable man, even though he will deny it. He's a medical doctor. He used to be a commandant, that's a lieutenant colonel. He volunteered for service. He specializes in anesthetic or something. I can't say the word what he actually is. I don't know how to say that in English or Afrikaans. Rebecca tried to taught me this morning, but after a while she said, let the doctor speak, because you can't do that. And that's fine, I can't do that. Eric Solomons, you're very welcome here, or Solomon, rather. You're very welcome here, sir. Thank you for being here. It's a fascinating episode. There's going to be more episodes. I don't even know where to start, so I'll ask you. You were born in 1944, sir. That was during the time of the war. Can you tell us how you became a medical doctor and then you volunteered for the South African Army? Later you went to Israel, then Ireland, and now you're in another country.
Right, Chris. With such an illustrious introduction, I don't really know where to start. But what I do want to start is I just want to first of all say that my own military career was hardly mentionable. When I've had a look at some of the legacy conversations that you've presented, and I see what unbelievable heroes have actually appeared on your program. These guys really were amazing. Each and every one of them with stories that are hair-raising. And when you realize how serious the threat was to them out there, mere youngsters, schoolboys, having just left school and pulled into the army and put in an extremely dangerous situation. These guys were brave, and the people who never went there will never know this, never really understand it. And so my story is nothing quite as exciting as that, but it is different. And I think it is important because I've learned a lot of lessons about this, just about life in general. And some of these lessons I'd like to sort of share with people who were in the army and people who had connections to family. Some of the stories were good. Some of the things that have happened have been not so good. And at some stage in our talk, I really want to bring up something that I find is a very perturbing sort of a thing. And that is that some of the people who served and did their country, stood steadfast, once they left, were left in dire straits, to put it simply. We will address that later, and certainly I think it's important that people are aware of this, because there are many people who are left in this situation. Okay, so having said that, I'd like to sort of describe what led me to do this, because after all, at that time many people were trying to avoid the call-up, and would do anything to avoid the call-up. And eventually a lot of people left the country because of the call-up when the Bush War became more intensive. But I'll refer to that later. But I can sort of start, I think, by just describing, as you said, I was born in Barakpan, which is the butt end of many jokes, as we all know. And my friends always like to send me jokes, sort of telling me, what a funny place Brakpan is. And I always like reminding them I was born there. But I was born on the East Rand in Brakpan. My parents were married there. My dad actually came from Springfontein in the Free State. He was born in Springfontein, my mother in Johannesburg. And I was born at a nursing home called Golla's Nursing Home. And strangely enough, the reason I mention it is because prior to leaving Benoni, the last anesthetic I ever gave was in Golla's Nursing Home. So my father was transferred by work to various places. And so we moved from Brakpan to Benoni, then Germiston, then Potchefstroom. And I was a young lighty in Potchefstroom and grew up in Potchefstroom. It was a wonderful place to sort of grow up, with sluice watering of the gardens on a Wednesday, and looking for crabs at the dam in Potchefstroom there, so we could make crab necklaces and so forth. But that was the first time I saw that there was a military camp there in Potchefstroom. And this is the first time I actually had any inkling about, soldiers, etc., etc. Then my father was transferred to Pretoria, and I was to spend the next 17 years in Pretoria. I went to school there, and in high school, at the Clapham High, we had to do cadets. We first started off as military cadets, army cadets, and then for some odd reason they changed over to Air Force cadets. I'm not quite sure what the reason for that was, but they took cadets very serious at our school. And I remember every Tuesday when we had cadets, if you pitched up at school with your toe caps not boned and your cap strap not boned, you'd be in for it much better. But we learned all the basics of drill, and we learned it very well indeed. And so that stood us in good stead. In Standard 9, I don't remember if I volunteered or not, but I must have volunteered because not the whole school went, but we had about 25 guys, I think, went to, in the July holidays, to Valhalla Camp, which was the Air Force Gymnasium at the time. And there we were going to learn Wehrmacht procedure and so forth. It was cold, it was winter, and you know what Highveld winters can be like. And this was the very first time that we had actually come into a conflict zone, and that was between the Sotis and the Afrikaans guys. We had an English bungalow, and our bungalow was the only English bungalow that was there during this 3-week period. And it was quite obvious that snort and trane were going to happen sooner or later, and it happened sooner rather than later. So one night we just knew that we must prepare for an attack, and unfortunately it was the night before we were going to have an inspection the next day. And you know that you don't sleep on your bed the night before inspection, because they will come there and rip your bed up in any event, even if you squared it off with matchboxes and so forth. Okay, and your trommel has to be packed and all that sort of stuff. But that of course, they came in, these guys, and they used towels with soap in the bottom of it, like clay lut, like you clay lut somebody. And there was a hell of a fight. And I tell you, our bungalow was wrecked, completely wrecked. Everything was wrecked. I don't remember the name of all the guys other than one. Nobby Wood was his name, a smallish guy. And he really got clocked up badly. But we had a real fight. And of course, the camp commandant was called in, and there was chaos, and we all, I won't tell you what we did, but we were in trouble. And that was the first and last time actually there was a problem at this camp. It was very memorable because it was cold, and we had to be parate there because there was no slopness, even though we were only at school, but we were treated as if we were soldiers, etc. So we had to drill, and we had a drill like you can't believe. Now there were 2 drill corporals that were in charge of us. The one guy became very well known afterwards, and his name was Cornelis Cronje, and Cornelis Cronje was doing apparently a BCom at the time, but him and his buddy who took us, they used to give us a very hard time. We'd stand at ease between sessions and say, okay, guys, stand at ease, but you don't move. And then, of course, they sit there cracking dirty jokes, and of course, everybody laughed. So they gave us extra sort of sessions. Cornelis Cronje went on to actually become a pilot, and he also played rugby for Northern Transvaal and became a Springbok. So he was a well-known guy. And then he became a captain in South African Airways, and I met him once on a flight when I was living in Cape Town later. Les Ryan, who was a friend of mine, introduced me to the flight deck. In those days, you could do that. And I met Cornelis Cronje there many, many years later, but he didn't remember the incident originally. Okay, so that was that at the Valhalla at the Air Force gym. Then I left school, matriculated and left school, and I was not a great student at school because I really wasn't motivated. I hadn't ever learned really how to study. I didn't really know what it is about. I had an older brother who was doing architecture at Tucky's, and my brother and I, he used to sort of set the level for me, and I didn't really know what it meant to apply oneself. So I didn't have, a great time, and I didn't even have great memories of school per se. But then I came along, and I decided in 1963 that I would like to go to I'd like to go to university. But as I say, my school marks were not brilliant. But as we lived in Pretoria, if I was going to have a chance, it was going to be Tucky's, you see. So of course, coming from an English-speaking school, your Afrikaans is not so, it's not great, but you pass matric, but what does it really mean? So Tucky's fortunately had a very interesting way of approaching the subject. They were not particularly interested in people who got brilliant matrics, because their feeling was that they didn't always make good doctors. In fact, they're not necessarily good at a tertiary level. So their idea was to say, okay, what we will do is we'll let everybody in first year, and we'll sort you out after second year, after first year. So I'll never forget the first lecture in physics. We were all gathered in the AE auditorium, and there were 1,500 people. And I looked around and I thought, 1,500 guys. I mean, this is unbelievable. They weren't all medical students. They were BSc science and all that, and dentistry and honest to God students for veterinary school. But it was daunting to see so many people there, and it was all in the medium of Afrikaans. Now, I'd never heard an Afrikaans lecture in my life. So we did a few sort of aptitude tests were done during the next couple of days, but on our first prac class in botany, our Professor Mani van der Schuyf stood in front of the class, and we were all sitting in the laboratory there with the stethoscope, microscope in front of us. And Professor van der Schuyf said, "Manne, kyk links, kyk regs. Net een van julle gaan deurkom na die tweede jaar toe." Yes, and I knew that this guy on my left had 6 distinctions, the guy on my right had 7 distinctions, and I had no distinctions. I thought, anyway, that was a make or break day for me in my life. I went home that night and I thought, geez, how am I going to do this? I mean, the odds are against me, and but I thought, bugger it, sooner or later I've got to stand up and do something. And that was an epiphany for me that day. Anyway, cut a long story short, at the end of the year, there were 340 people in our class, 109 passed, and 75 were accepted into second year. And I was one of them. These two on either side did not pass, by the by. He was right. How he knew that, I have no idea, but that's exactly what happened. Okay, so now we're going to start with medicine proper. And what can I say? It was wonderful. All of a sudden doing dissection and all that kind of stuff. It was really medicine, but it wasn't people yet. It was just still, all the important subjects, physiology, which was going to be the basis of everything going forward, and anatomy, of course, which I really enjoyed, but it was a hang of a lot to learn, and the 2 other subjects, biochemistry and so forth. So carrying on, I fortunately had a very good university career. I was fortunate. I never failed anything, and I got through and became a doctor in 1968. But going along the way, the military offered scholarships to people who were interested or couldn't afford to, or possibly were interested in joining the military. And for every year that they put you through, you'd owe the military 2 years. And I first saw the scheme, and I think it was 1964 in second year, but definitely 1963 third year. That's where, you know, there were quite a few of these guys. And I can mention some of the names because some of them actually went on to become pretty big. There was Hippie Boyson, who became a general in the Air Force. He actually flew Mirages. There was Ken Ingham, who I think is still involved in aviation medicine somewhere along the line. I'm not quite sure because I lost contact with these guys. There were other chaps like Colin Harwood, who was the year behind me. He joined the Navy, and I know he went down to Natal Command at some stage, and but I lost contact with him. And then there was a year ahead of me was a guy, Dries Jones, in the Navy as well. And in that year as well, there was Pini Jacobs, who was in the army, and he became somebody quite big up in Southwest Africa, I think in Grootfontein. I'm not quite sure what eventually happened to him. Maybe somebody will be able to put a name to him. Then, of course, there was a very well-known guy who I didn't know then, but Tony Dippenaar, who became a surgeon, and I know spent a lot of time up in Angola and so forth. I think he's even mentioned in Colonel Jan Breitenbach's book, 32 Battalion. So these guys were all there. Oh, there was another very good friend of mine who is still an incredibly good friend of mine, John Eloff. He did dentistry through the Air Force. His father was a very interesting character. He saw a lot of action in his life. J.Z. Eloff, he flew up north. He also flew in the Berlin Air Bridge after the war, and then he flew with 2 Squadron in Korea. Now, he's really one of my heroes, this guy, John's father, Colonel Eloff, because after that, he became OC of 28 Squadron, and which was the Hercules Squadron up in Waterkloof. And used to see him. I really admired this man because he was such a good guy. Never mind a brilliant pilot, but he was just a wonderful man. He then became OC of Donato Flying School and ended up as Brigadier of Transport Command. So he was a great guy. And as I say, his son, John, to this day is still a friend of mine. He lives in Cape Town, and he's an orthodontist there. So where are we now? We're so I qualified, and in 1969 I started my house job. We all, of course, had to do a house job, and my house job was done at the Boksburg Benoni Hospital, and which wasn't too far from where I was born in Brakpan. So Brakpan, Benoni, and Boksburg. And that turned to be also an incredibly important year for me, because I learned a lot of hands-on stuff at this hospital. It was an 850-bed hospital, and there were 6 of us housemen, and we all had a turn at casualty. And of course, we learned a lot about hands-on medicine. There were 6,000 confinements a year at this place, and so we all had to learn how to do vacuum extractions and forceps deliveries and cesarean sections. And luckily enough, I mean, it's going to stand me in good stead later when I went into practice, that I could actually do cesarean sections and all the sort of emergency operations that one needed to be able to do. And so I don't want to spend too much time on what happened there, but I just, an incident happened that we decided to, I had a week's holiday. I had a week's holiday, and my brother and I decided to go to Mozambique. And this is in 1969 now. So my brother had a very good friend, Yanni Nel, who had been going to Inyaka Island for many years, and he had a very good African friend, Efsom, over there, and he would phone Efsom and say, listen, we're coming for a holiday, and Efsom would set up a sort of little camp there on the southern part of Inyaka Island, and we would go along. So my brother and I went and we joined Yanni, and we had a wonderful holiday on this island. And I sort of fell in love with Mozambique, I must say. I just thought it was a wonderful place. You know, there was such an unbelievably continental atmosphere in Lorenzo Marx. It was just wonderful. It's hard to describe, but it just had an attraction for me. And while we were there on this island, one day I was just sitting and I watched this yacht come towards us, and it sort of just threw anchor just off, and the guys come on land. And it was a guy by the name of Dr. Van Sale, who was a vet. So I started chatting to him. I said, you know, what markie are you? And he said, well, he used to be in Vereniging. He was a vet there. He had a yacht on the Vaal. And he said, no, man, this is ridiculous. So he became the state vet for Mozambique at the time. And he used to spend his time sailing up and down the coast there. So he was an interesting guy to meet. And I thought, what a good place this must be, you know. And I thought, imagine having a sort of flying doctor service here or something like that. You know, that's something that I'd actually thought of, but I'll come back to that later. So that is where I became interested in it. And of course, I had very little understanding of what was going on in the country at the time. But I did recall on this very first visit that we were standing near the station there after we'd disembarked, coming back from Inyaka. And there were a whole lot of Portuguese soldiers standing around, and I noticed, to my dismay, there were 3 or 4 coffins lying next to them. And so I gathered that, you know, something was hotting up there, and we didn't really know what it's all about. But I did make it my business to find out later. I became very interested in it. And I started reading up as much as I could. There wasn't a lot for the public to read at that time. But I managed to get my hands on a book, which was banned, funny enough, at the time. It is called The Struggle for Mozambique by Eduardo Mondlane, I think was his name. And in it, he describes what was going on in Mozambique at the time. And, you know, and these guys were living, the locals were impoverished. I mean, they really were. And the Portuguese were, you know, sending the cotton and all that back to Europe and so forth. So the people were unhappy and one thing or another. But I'll leave it at that because you know, I don't know enough about it, but what I did learn was when I eventually went into practice, I'll come back to this again just now, a lot of Portuguese people came from there and became my patients in Benoni, because there's a lot of industries in Benoni, and a lot of people came from Madeira, also Portuguese, and they were a very strong community in Benoni. So from them, I learned a lot about what was going on there. Okay, so I came back, and the rest of the year was uneventful at Boksburg, Benoni. And as I say, I gained a lot of experience, fortunately, and which was to stand me in good stead later. So at the end of the year, in 1969, I got married, and we went over to London, just to my first time overseas, just to get some idea of what was going on there. And I managed to get a job at St. Mary's Hospital. It's one of the 6 teaching hospitals in London. And this is when South Africans were still appreciated, I must tell you. I'm not so sure it is the case today, but then South Africans were appreciated. So I walked into the first place to see if I could get a job, and I go to the chief, and he says to me, look, pleased to meet you and all that. To get this job, you need at least a part 1 of the fellowship exam. That's the special exam, you know, if you want to even just get the job, you know. Now here I am, I've just finished my house job. I've got no experience whatsoever other than what I picked up as a houseman. And so I tell the guy that, yeah, look, this is it. So he said to me, by the way, do I know Louis Bock? So I said, yes, I do know Louis Bock, because in fact, Louis Bock was a general practitioner in Uitenhage down in the Cape. And as a 4th year medical student in 1966, I had to go and spend 6 weeks with a general practice just to see what it's like. And Louis Bock was one of the partners. Louis Book, unbeknown to me, was one of the favorite guys at St. Mary's Hospital. They liked him. He played rugby. He was a real good guy. So my boss, Dr. Wilcox, said to me, "The job's yours. When do you want to start?" So I thought, wow, I mean, that was good. And it turned out great. So it was wonderful. And it gave me the opportunity to sort of travel around and see what London was all about. And some of the things I saw in London were impressive. I actually went to the war rooms. I don't know if anybody's been to the war rooms in London. This is where the war was directed by Churchill and so forth. Very interesting rooms. And it was really nice to sort of see that. I went to the Imperial War Museum, and from the Richthoven's plane engine is lying there, and a lot of interesting stuff one is able to sort of see when you go to these places. By the way, penicillin was discovered at this hospital, St. Mary's Hospital, and there's a plaque in there. You can see exactly which room it was discovered. And another famous guy who worked there was Roger Bannister, the man who broke the first 4-minute mile. He was a neurologist there. And also, for those rugby fans, JPR Williams, the Welsh and Lions fullback, he was a second-year medical student when I was at St. Mary's. So I knew all these guys. And we had a wonderful time there, staying at the medical students hostel. And I don't know how those guys ever get through medicine, because they drank every night and parties and whatever have you. I mean, it was wonderful. And there were guys from all over the world studying there. And so we had a wonderful time. But 6 months later, the time had come to go home and start earning a living. So my idea was to become a general practitioner, and Benoni was a great place at that time. And I was approached by a friend of my brother's. My brother was an architect by the stage, and asked me to join their practice. So I joined a 5-man practice in Benoni in 1970. And I stayed there for 5 years. Now, during this time, what can I say? This is the time that I actually was involved in joining Benoni Commando. My thinking at the time was that I was so grateful to have had received an amazing education. I can only sing the praises of Tukkies. I can only say how wonderful our training was there. There was, in all fairness, never any discrimination against anybody. Patients were always treated with respect, regardless of what race or creed. And there were 6 wonderful years. So I felt that, I was never called up. Somehow my name just missed the draft. The guys, my friends, were being called up left, right, and center in those days. And I was never called up. So I just felt it was my duty to at least do some form of military service if I could. Now I'm a general practitioner. And so a friend of mine who I'd met, I don't think he could have been a patient of mine, I'm not sure at the time. Yanni Greef became Major Greef. He mentioned to me that they were looking for they didn't have a medical officer at Benoni Commando. So would I be interested? And so I said, yeah, sure. So I joined Benoni Commando and as their medical officer in 1970. And it was very nice to sort of be in a unit like that, because I didn't have to sort of go anywhere. I didn't have to sort of leave the family, etc. at that stage, and I could do whatever needed to be done in Benoni. So Voortrekhoogte is not far away from Benoni, and I could, with ease drive through to Voortrekhoogte, and whatever I needed as a medical officer, I got all that information from the military side there, And of course, what is important to teach the guys, look, I didn't have anything to do with training the chaps as far as military affairs goes. I just needed to be the medical officer, which I was very happy to do, because the essentials of treating any patient, really, if you think about it, is to how to triage people, how to look after people who are suddenly injured with serious injuries. It can be overwhelming. I don't have to tell you, when you're confronted with somebody with a serious injury with blood loss and loss of airway. And this to me has always been essential in teaching people, and particularly medics who are going to go and accompany soldiers out in the bush and so forth, how to look after an airway and how to arrest bleeding and make sure of the essentials to keep a guy alive until you can get into somebody who knows really how to look after the patients. So that was in essence what I excuse me, what I was going to do with the medics that were in our unit. Now, Major Greef, who was our training officer, he joined the commandos in '63 when it was known as Oostrand Commando, which comprised of both Boksburg and Benoni Commandos together. They separated in 1965 or '66 and became Benoni Commando. And Jan did his initial training as junior leader and platoon commander at SAI in Oudtshoorn in '64. And in '66, he went on to train at Dani Tehran Combat School in Kimberley, I think it is. He tells me also that initially national servicemen who had done their training were given the option to afterwards to do their camps with the commandos. So a lot of the guys actually chose to do this. But then there were some guys, of course, who didn't fulfill their pledges and decided not to AWOL, but just not to, heed to the call-ups. But Jan got the local procurator to sort that out, and that came to an end very quickly. So the blokes who had to do their camps, they did their camps. Jan Greef is an unbelievably strict guy and stood no nonsense, and that was wonderful, I must say. What was the function of the commando at the time? It was basically to look after the local protection of the local people, of course, and also to make sure that there was or assisting police with crowd controls, and deformations and so forth. But also what was incredibly important was to win the minds and hearts of the people. I mean, it's no good if they hate you, they're going to not work with you. So there were courses offered by the military, and I know Jan went down to Port Natal to do the course of so-called burgersake, where they taught you how to, actually win the hearts of people and so forth, which is very important. So we try to put on a reasonable front that people understood we were not people's enemies. We were there for the protection of all. We did camps and bivvies. In the 5 years I was there, we did 2 camps at Suikerbosrand Nature Reserve. Now, Suikerbosrand Nature Reserve is not too far from Heidelberg. And when it became a nature reserve per se, we were fortunate enough to be able to continue training on a farm just on the other side of the Heidelberg Vereniging Road. It is a farm run by an Italian consortium by Mr. Benoni, and he was very grateful to have us there because he knew that the local vagrants who tended to sort of drift onto the farm, and as they tend to do, would be a lot better for his farm if he had Wehrmacht on the farm. You see, so very happily he welcomed us and couldn't go out of his way to do more for us. He was so happy that he used to organize us to have mess evenings there. And I remember one evening there, we used to sit around, in order of rank, Mr. Benoni at the head with our OC, Commandant Marius Hotting, and then Jan Greef, and then myself, and the guys would go down in order of rank. And they would serve us wonderful meals, and followed by Italy's version of Witblitz. It's called grappa. And this is the sort of stuff as rocket fuel, I can tell you. Grappa will send anybody horizontal within a short while. But so that was very interesting. But we had lots of camps over there, and bivvies in particular. Setting up temporary bases was important for us because that's, you know, possibly what we were going to do in future. And one came into mind in a particular day. Jan set up this camp, and there was a tremendous thunderstorm. There was lightning and rain and thunder, and Jan became concerned that there were some guys who could be in trouble. So he sent out a truck or two to go and pick up these guys, and everybody was accounted for except one. Troopie Abbott was his name, and eventually Abbott was found fast asleep, totally oblivious of a storm going on outside him with lightning. I mean, but anyway, that was that. So we had to go to the shooting range, and when we were on camp out at Suikerbosrand, we would do our shooting at the range in Heidelberg, and that's where we had to qualify, if you could. And I managed to qualify for marksman, bronze, not silver, I'm afraid, but only bronze. But that was that. There were many sort of, as I say, bivvies. One of the camps I organized, special training camp designated for the medics, how to treat patients in the bush. The terrain was very good for that sort of thing. And on this particular occasion, the guys were lying, trying to resuscitate a guy, and all of a sudden there was a rinkels over there, and the one guy shot his rinkels with. We didn't have live ammo, we had blanks, but I didn't realize you could actually do damage with a blank at very close range. But that's the first time I'd ever seen anything like that. But that I recall. But it was wonderful to be able to teach the basics of how to maintain an airway. And I, to this day, insist on teaching anybody, whether he be a nurse, she be a nurse or doctor, whatever it is, and people, civilians, how to look after an airway, because it's so simple and it is so important, yet so few people really know how to do it. So that's what it was, my whole idea with training, to train these guys to control hemorrhage and airway management. The rest you can let somebody else do later, as long as you keep him alive by doing those basic things. One of our camps we had was to protect Atlas Aircraft Company, which is, as you know, is on the periphery of what was called Jan Smuts Airport. I think today it's called something else, Oliver Tambo or something. So we had to look after this, and it was quite important to see how a unit actually does that. And it was, it may have been a bit of a boring camp, but it was very, very well worthwhile. Two incidents remain with me. The one was that a brigadier from Wit Command came out to give us a surprise visit just to see how things were working. And he pitched up at the gate, and he had dark glasses on, and the guard stopped him and asked for his ID. And he looked at the ID and he looked at the brigadier, and the two didn't match. He said, "Sorry, I can't let you in." So this brigadier, I mean, started getting a little bit upset. So I asked him to take his glasses off. And then he said, "Okay, now I can see it is you," and he let him in. So the brigadier actually commended this young guy for doing what he did. Well, which was fine, and I think it was wonderful as well. The next thing is the guy presents to me with abdominal pain. I'm doing a morning sort of clinic there, and I say to him, "What's the matter?" "No, he's had this pain." "How long have you had the pain for?" He tells me, "No, it's started recently." So I examined him, and I had to send him into town for x-rays, because of course we don't have that sort of facility out in the camp. And the radiologist phoned me to say, "You won't believe what I see here." just so he sent me the plates, and there were 2 6-inch nails in this guy's abdomen. 2 6-inch nails. I kid you not. So I said to him, "Hoe het hierdie daar opgedaag? Sê vir my, how did they get there?" So he said, "No, well, he's a carpenter, you know, and he was busy working, a builder. And some guy came, he had these 2 nails in his mouth, you know, like you do when you're knocking nails in, and some guy clapped him on the back, you know, and he swallowed them." I said, "What?" I mean, 2 6-inch nails. But anyway, you see things like this in medicine, and this you learn not to be surprised after a while. So that was that. 2 other things I just want to mention as far as is concerned. 3, sorry. We used to do bivvies out at a place called Mapleton, several miles from Benoni, and so we would go and do short sort of bivvies and not full camps. This would be on a weekend and so forth. And Jan and I, on several of these occasions, would run out there. I had actually started running to try and keep fit in the early 70s. Okay, while I was in general practice, and we offered the trippies to run out, but they preferred going out by Bedford. So we tried to set an example to these guys. But so that was where we did certain bivvies. There was another place north of Benoni, I cannot remember the name, where we used to go to the shooting range as well. So the guys were quite proficient as far as shooting was concerned, and Jan insisted on this. So he would also have sudden call-ups on during the weekend, for instance, to see how quickly he could mobilize the mono to come to the HQ in case of emergency, which was actually good. And there was an amazing success rate with at which they could actually get people to come into the unit in case of emergency. So I would say that the unit was pretty parat as far as that's concerned. And you know, we weren't just hanging around. Everybody was involved. On one occasion, we had a display, a military display there with the SAF coming in. And it is a public demonstration of Casevac in Benoni at Willamore Park. And we were going to arrange a Casevac evacuation of somebody injured on the ground. So at Willamore Park, there was an explosion, etc. Troops were ambushed, and we had to fly in with the Puma and pick him up. So it was quite impressive, and it worked very well. I remember the name of the pilot. His name was John Church, and I think he was an incredibly well-known guy in the SAF. I'm sure that you guys will know him later. And but that was good. I enjoyed that, and we managed to put on a good show there without without doing anything untoward. There was a sergeant in the unit. His name I forget, but he was known as Sergeant One Way. He collected trucks. He collected trucks for one of our bivvies from Benoni Commando, and he drove this whole convoy down a one-way street in Johannesburg and put everybody. I mean, really, it was quite embarrassing, but that was that. We got the freedom of the town in Benoni, and we practiced pretty hard for that. We had to get some trooper mana in from Boksburg Commando just to fill the numbers, because you know, it was going to be some really good parade, and John Barrable was the mayor, and we had this wonderful parade in Tom Jones Avenue outside the town hall. And during the parade, OC Marius must have forgotten the sequence, because now we were standing open order, and after all the things were done, finally we had to close order march and then move off. But he unfortunately gave the command right turn in open order. Of course, this was going to be chaotic, because troops are not supposed to listen to an order that's is not correct. So Major Jan Greef again saw this thing happening, and in a flash he superseded and told us close order march, and then so he saved the day, and the parade turned out wonderfully, and we didn't let the side down at all. Well, I have to sort of more or less end on one story here, because we had a formal mess dinner, and unbeknown to us, one of our sergeant majors, Henny Kutzer, was a naughty guy. We had two sergeant majors, Steve Carmel and Henny Kutzer, and then we had a RSM Cochrane, who was a wonderful Second World War veteran, a great guy. And the three of them really had a good influence on the discipline of the unit. But after this mess dinner, Henny Kutzer organized a party unbeknown to us, unbeknown to our OC, and definitely unbeknown to Jan and myself. We didn't know about it. So we pitched up at the party. It was a party per se. It was going to be a show of sorts. So there we are in a U formation in this room. It's not a very big room, but enough to seat us all. And in walks Glenda Kemp. Now, I don't know if anybody remembers Glenda Kemp. Glenda Kemp was a strip artist, and she had a snake, a python by the name of Opa. So now we're all sitting there in close quarters, and Glenda Kemp does her act. And she then proceeds with her python to start putting this python around the neck of people around her. Well, of course, I must say, the guys were feeling a bit nervous. And this snake to me looked like it was a bit agitated. And in front of me is sitting Major Jan Greef. And I realized that he was a true man, Jan Greef, because he sat there with his arms folded as she put the snake around his neck. And the snake was like salivating all over the place on this guy's decent mess kit. I tell you something. And Jan didn't bat an eyelid. And I thought, oh, I just hope that he didn't try this trick with me. I don't know if I'm going to be as cool as Jan. But anyhow, that was a memorable night. And so what else can I say about the unit? There are lots of fun memories. The OC of Oosterland Regiment, he would organize, when he knew we were in camp, organize mock attacks in our camp, and our OC would do the same back. So just to improve on parate, we would sort of, do these little things. And in the end, it all turned out well. And I must say, I thoroughly enjoyed my time with the Benoni Commando, which, as I say, lasted until the end of 1974. We had a reunion in 2011 and in Benoni, and unfortunately a lot of the guys have died since then. And our OC, Marius Hutting, who was Afrikaans master at Benoni High, he wasn't very well at the time and has since passed away. I believe the unit had been up to the border, which I thought was unusual, because they didn't know that they were going up to the border, but they did, apparently. Graham Volmer was then the OC. He was a young lieutenant in my day. And it was very nice to meet the guys, but we were all much older, of course, by that stage, 2011. And what can I say? At the time, I was starting to give a lot of anesthetics in general practice, and it was quite stressful for me. I must say I enjoyed practice. I didn't find practice stressful, other than the fact that I was having to do a lot of anesthetics, as the GPs tend to do in the smaller towns, because there are not enough specialists anywhere in the world, but certainly in South Africa, there was a great shortage of anesthetists. Most of them were in bigger centers. So I ended up having to give a lot of anesthetics and sometimes in dangerous sort of situations. So I was not at ease with that. And I thought to myself, if I'm going to stay in general practice, I must sort of try and teach myself more about anesthetics. So I started studying anesthetics in detail myself because, you know, there was no time to go on courses or anything like that. So I actually started enjoying what I was reading because, you know, I had to do difficult cases, sometimes dangerous cases like cesarean sections, which could be very tricky. And I became quite efficient at what I was doing. And so I realized that, yeah, I've gone this far, maybe I should try and actually do the first part of the exam, which is unusual because you do this only in a teaching hospital as such. But there was no chance that I was going to go to a teaching hospital at this stage because, you know, I mean, I had this 2 small children, and I just really couldn't afford to all of a sudden give it up and go to Johannesburg General or whatever it was. So I decided what I was going to do is try and do the exam myself. So I went to see the College of Medicine in Johannesburg, and I spoke to the registrar there, and I said, this is what I want to do. And they said to me, no, listen, we suggest you give up general practice and go and get yourself an anesthetic post. I said to them, I couldn't really afford to do that. So they said to me, Dr. Solomon, you just need to know we don't go out of our way to pass people in this exam. So I said, well, can you tell me at least which books I can use? They said, we don't. We're an examining body, and that's that. So it's up to you as to what you do. So I got in my car and I drove to West Dean bookstore in Hillbrow. And I said to the lady there, give me any book that you've ever given to anybody doing anesthetics. And I walked out of there. I could barely carry these books. There were so many. And I put them in the back of my car and I rode home and I thought to myself, you've bitten off too much here, you know, what are you trying to do? Anyhow, cut a long story short, I started studying and by myself, and it was a pretty hard job because I was a full-time general practitioner. I started to run, as I told you, so I was, you know, trying to keep fit, try to fit that in. And I'm in the army part-time, and I'm trying to study for an exam which they are not going to try and pass me. So my plate was full at the time, and but I learned one lesson in life, and that started from day one when we was told to look left and look right, that only one of you is going to pass. And I realized then that if you really want to do something hard, badly enough, you'll do it. And I put my mind to it, you know, and I worked my ass off, to put it plainly. And eventually the exam came. I did this within the year, and I went and I wrote the exam, and I passed miraculously. Four of us passed out of 17, so they really didn't go out of the way to sort of actually help you pass. But now I'm sitting in Benoni, and I've got the first part of the specialist exam. And what I do, I can't do the second part because that you have to do in a teaching hospital. So I came to the conclusion that I'll have to give up general practice and go into do it to specialize. But I didn't want to do it in Johannesburg because, if you can recall, the first heart transplant was done in 1967 by Professor Chris Barnard, and I was a fifth-year medical student at the time, and those were halcyon days. Everybody focused in all over the world on Groote Schuur Hospital. Chris Barnard was virtually the center of the universe at the time. It was quite amazing. And I thought to myself, it would be absolutely wonderful if I could get a job at Groote Schuur. But I knew that it wasn't going to be easy because they're not going to look at a guy from Benoni who wants to all of a sudden come and do anesthetics. But I thought to myself, bugger this. If you want to do something bad enough, bloody will do it. So what I did was, in 1974, on the day that the Springboks got clopped by the Lions in Cape Town. I managed to get on the plane that Friday, and I went down to see the professor of anesthetics at Groote Schuur Hospital, Professor Bull, Arthur Bull. And lucky I got a ticket because, I mean, you can imagine, every oak and his dog wants to go and see the rugby game. And so I got a ticket, but it was meant to be, I think. I got on the plane and I walked into Groote Schuur Hospital and I met Professor Bull. And I think he was quite impressed by the fact that I'd taken the trouble to come and see him. And he said to me, look, you know, Dr. Solomon, you have to know that lots of people want to come and work in this hospital at the moment. You know, we get lots of people and we give preference, in fact, to a lot of people from overseas, because there were a lot of overseas doctors working there. Everybody wanted to work at Groote Schuur. So he said, but I'll see what I can do. It's not just up to me. It's the whole committee has to sort of okay your acceptance, etc. And if it all goes well, I'll let you know. So he said to me, he was quite impressed by the fact that I'd actually managed to sort of do part one of the examination, because it turned out that, you know, the guys were dropping like flies, as they say. The attrition rate with this examination was very high, but fortunately I had it. And it wasn't long, he wrote back to me and he was very, very welcoming and so forth. And I got the job at Groote Schuur. And I was over the moon. I was absolutely over the moon to think that I'm actually going to get there. And so in 1975, we packed up in Benoni and we moved now to Cape Town. And that was going to be the next phase of my life was going to sort of be in Cape Town. I don't know how long we've been going there, Chris.
We about an hour, and I have a question for you about Professor Chris, because okay. I've heard somewhere that man would only appoint the most beautiful nurses to work with him. Is that true?
Well, listen, that I can't tell you whether it's true or not, but he had an eye for the ladies. That's a fact of life. I mean, you know, I'd be lying if I said otherwise. And he was one amazing guy. We can spend a lot of time talking about that when the time comes. But he certainly was a charismatic guy, and he was the only person I ever knew that when he walked into the room, you felt his presence. You didn't even have to look at him. You knew he was there. We had an amazing time with Chris Barnard. I've sent you one of the pictures I've given you. There is of a picture of the 10th anniversary taken in 1977. Chris Barnard was an institution, and he had an amazing effect on everybody's lives, because he was well known. He was an opportunist. Let's put it like this, because if you actually look at the history of heart transplant and heart transplantation, there were other guys who were doing, you know, there was Shungwei, and there were people who had actually, there was an American pediatric cardiologist who I think actually did the first transplant in a child, but I just can't remember his name. But Chris was the guy who actually had the guts to sort of actually do it. Strangely enough, when I was working in London at St. Mary's Hospital, and I'd seen TV, because TV only came into South Africa, if you remember, in 1976. So now this is 1970, and on the TV, there was Malcolm Muggeridge from the BBC interviewing Chris. And he says to Chris, yeah, it's because life is so cheap, you know, in South Africa. That's why, you know, you guys did this thing first. Chris could actually, he'd never lose an argument. He just had a way, you know, with his lovely accent from Beaufort West. You know, Chris was an amazing guy, and nobody ever got the better of Chris, I can assure you. But now that you mentioned Chris, and I can just bring up a little incident at Groote Schuur. When I was, part of our routine at Groote Schuur was, of course, we had to cover everything: pediatric anesthesia, cardiac anesthesia. You know, before you could actually write your examination, we at Kritske had covered everything, and it's such a vast setup. We had something like 30 theatres, and there were 30 registrars and 30 consultants at the time. So there was unbelievable opportunity to get experience. But one of the things that I remember, because nobody ever spoke back to Chris Barnard, you just didn't do it. But one of the things, we had a wonderful professor of anesthesia at Red Cross. His name was Professor Tom Voss, and he was an amazing, immaculate, fanatical, accurate anesthetist. And you have to be when you're giving anesthetics to small children, you see. And everybody, including Chris Barnard, respected Tom Voss. So on this particular occasion, we were doing a small baby of a month old, and it is a VSD, it's a hole in the heart operation. And this small child is really, I mean, you've got to be pedantic about everything you do. There's no sort of, there's no place for error when you're doing a procedure like this in anesthesia or surgery for a small child. And the operating area is so small, you've got to understand. So I was the registrar, and Professor Tom Voss was the anesthetist, was in charge, and the two of us were doing the anesthetic. And of course, you separated from the patient and the surgeon with the green towel, But if I tell you, I mean, Chris was probably standing an arm's length away from me. It's a very small area, and he used to like voicing his opinion. If anything wasn't right, it's the anesthetist's fault always. It's always our fault. It's nobody else's fault, that you have to know. And in this particular case, well, I tell you, the blood pressure, it was vacillating, and there was all sorts of things. He was complaining. He didn't stop complaining. He kept on at us, at me, I should say. And the next minute, Tom Voss is standing behind me, and he was a small guy, diminutive guy. And Tom all of a sudden just reached over and grabbed Chris by the chest here, and he just shook him like this. And Chris said to him, "Tom, agorio, agorio." And that, he didn't hear another word from Chris during that procedure. But other than that, you never ever spoke back to Chris. What was good is his brother Marius was a wonderful surgeon as well, as part of the team. Marius had a sense of humor, and you could at least, speak back to Marius, And you could have fun with Marius. And, if Marius was giving you a hard time, we had ways of getting back to him. And I never did this, but Chris Swart, who was an anesthetic consultant, also looked like Hardy's Opa. He had a long white beard. He would be sitting there listening, and then, if Marius was overdoing it, Chris would just take the catheter from the patient, because the patient lying on the table had a catheter, and put it in his rubber boot. So, of course, he'd empty the urine into Marius's boot, and of course, he could do nothing about it. He's in the middle of an operation. But that's the kind of fun we used to have with him, you see. So, but look, I could carry on for ages with Chris Barnard, but I think I must possibly also mention a little bit about my next military situation. So I transferred down to 20 field. I was put in 20 field ambulance. At the time, there was 12 field ambulance, 3 field ambulance, all down in the Western Cape. But I really knew nothing about the field ambulances per se. But 20 field ambulance is the one that I joined, and it dates back to its origin, the 21st of October 1899, when it started off as the Volunteer Medical Staff Corps. It was established in King Williamstown in the Eastern Cape, known then as the Cape Colony. But in 1974, the year before I joined, it was reformed from what they called a 23 field dressing station to a field ambulance, is what I was. So, in other words, it then became a unit in itself, 20 field ambulance, and 3 was as well. But the year after I left the Army in 1981, 3 of the units, that's 20 field, 3 field, and 12, all became 3 medical battalion group. But as I say, that all changed after I'd left, so I have no idea what happened then. But I joined 20 Field in 1975, and I must say I got promoted quite quickly. I became a major, and after a year, I got a substantive rank as commandant. Of course, with the rank comes a lot of responsibility, and people don't really know what responsibility is in a way. When you salute somebody, you're saluting the powers invested in that person. You're not saluting the guy. He's nothing special, but you are realizing that as a commanding officer, you've got a big responsibility. And one of the OCs of another unit, I'm not quite sure which one it was. I don't think it was 7 LA, but I'll mention them just now about one of the exercises we were on. He pulled me aside. He said, "Listen, I want to give you good advice. Now that you've been promoted to OC," he says, "don't try and do everything yourself. Learn to delegate, and learn to delegate properly. If you want to achieve anything, you need people to help you, and you need people who are capable of doing the job." And just at this stage, I just want to talk about the guy who was our adjutant. Because if ever there was a good adjutant, it was my adjutant. His name was Peter Hurley, Peter Hurley. And this guy knew how to run a unit. He was one amazing guy. The two OC of the unit was a chap by the name of Peter Swift, who was also at Grooteskeer. He was studying to become a physician. He eventually went on to become the head of the Sicily. It's a hospital just outside of East London. I'll think of the name just now. And he was a wonderful guy, Peter Swift, really a gentleman to his fingertips. But I just want to say a little bit about this guy, Peter Hurley. Peter Rod Hurley was an amazing guy. He was a pharmacist at the time. And I've never seen a guy so correct and with the ability to do so much. He was just one amazing guy and never ever had to raise his voice. He just knew exactly what to do. I'm just going to deviate a little bit from our unit here, because I'll just tell you his story quickly. Peter Hurley was a pharmacist, as I said, but then eventually decided he wanted to do medicine. So he actually upped with his wife, and they went to Pretoria, and he became a doctor. And then by this stage, I had left the army and I hadn't seen Peter, but I managed to contact Peter a couple of years ago because I knew he had emigrated to New Zealand. And what a success story. I mean, I have to tell you this because this guy, and I'll just read you this, I'll just have to read, because Peter Hurley, Dr. Wing Commander Peter Rod Hurley, Royal New Zealand Air Force, served in the New Zealand Army and the Royal New Zealand Air Force as a uniformed and civilian medical officer in a variety of roles since 1990, with particular emphasis on aviation and medicine. As the first formal trained aviation medicine specialist in the Air Force, Dr. Hurley has been the forefront of development in this field and influenced much of the aviation medicine policy that supports current air operations. From 2002 to 2005, there was a reduction in the size of the Air Force medical establishment, and during this time, he was the only serving Air Force doctor. He single-handedly maintained the medical services supported by a small staff. From 2005 to 2013, he served as the director of Air Force Medicine, during which time he rebuilt the capacity of the Air Force medical system. He has been active in Airspace Interoperability Council, serving for many years as the head of delegation for the Airspace Medicine Group. He's a council member of the Australasian Military Medicine Association, and for many years has been the Civil Aviation Authority medical examiner. He continues to support the Air Force operations in Relocating as a civil medical officer and member of the Active Reserve. 2 years ago, he tells me he was awarded the Distinguished Service Decoration by the Queen for the work done for the Air Force and aviation medicine. A few years later, he became director of Air Force Medicine, which he still holds He held until his retirement 9 years ago. Now, isn't that bloody remarkable? I mean, if I tell you he was a good guy, he was a good guy. So I had this bloke to rely on, and he could, from an admin point of view, do all the stuff that I didn't really, have a grip on. So my first camp, we had camps in, my first camp in 1975. It took place at Wingfield, and it was called, to the best of my knowledge, Operation Setuus. It was a whole lot of units participated in this, and it was a big exercise, actually. And we had put up quite a big hospital there, of course, anything that was really serious, we'd shunt off to the teaching hospitals nearby. But for all the small stuff, we could handle there. But what was interesting is that for the first time, and this is one of the things that I learned from Chris Barnard. Now, you have to understand, during my medical career, in Pretoria, we dealt with black and all sorts of patients, but black and white patients were separated, as everybody knows, in the apartheid years. The hospital is a black side and a white side. It was like that during my training. It was like that during my house here. But I've come to Groote now, all of a sudden, and I'm now working, amongst others, with Chris Barnard. And in Chris Barnard's wards, all that falls apart. Chris Barnard has everybody in the same ward, black and white. It didn't matter. And I couldn't believe it. There were black nurses treating white guys. I mean, this is the first time I'd ever seen it. I'm talking 1975. This sounds ridiculous now, but this is how it was. So here I have this tent, this little field hospital, and I have patients for the first time from the Cape Coloured Corps, who are also injured and whatever have you, allergies and bee stings and all sorts of stuff going on there. And I can't have a separate tent for these guys. So I said, no, this is it. Everybody together. So everybody who was involved in that exercise, if they needed treatment, they were all in the same bed, lying next to each other. And that was actually the first time, it sounds quite crazy and almost ridiculous, in fact, to say it, but the first time I'd seen that actually in the army in any event. That was it. Okay, so that was our first camp. In 1976, it was a watershed year, because in 1976 there were riots, and despite what was going on the border, this was a very uneasy sort of time to be in the army, or just to be in South Africa, in fact, because there was potential for serious disruption. And we were in camp at the time that this all happened. We just happened to be on a camp in Wingfield. And I wasn't even sure I'd see my family again, because things were happening very rapidly. All of a sudden, there were just 2 units in camp at the time, ourselves, and there were 7 light anti-aircraft. They were there as well. The next minute, a whole lot of police, a big police contingency was flown in from Pretoria, and they came and stayed at our camp as well. So, all of a sudden, things were changing rapidly, and there was a lot of unrest happening all around us. In fact, in the northern suburbs, in Bonteheuwel, Langa, all around Cape Town, I had no idea what was going on, because although we had comms and so forth, it was hard to know. It was, from our point of view, it all seemed quite chaotic, and we were waiting for things to happen. Why did this all happen? It took a while for me to really figure out. I'd heard that it is because the government had decided that Afrikaans was going to be the medium for teaching Black people. Was that really the case? Well, I did a lot of research afterwards to figure out what was all that. No, just to read what I'd read about this. In 1975, the government introduced a decree regarding tuition in schools by way of introducing Afrikaans as a teaching medium. The issue caused massive discontent and made resentment boil over. And in 1976 uprising, there was a decree issued by the Bantu Education Department. The minister, Andries Trenecht, who was a deputy minister, sent instructions to the school boards and inspectors and principals to the effect that Afrikaans should be put on an equal basis, not replaced, but put on an equal basis with English as a medium of instruction in all schools. This immediately drew negative reaction from various quarters. The first body to react was the Tswana school boards, and which comprised school boards from Meadowlands, Dobsonville, and other areas in Soweto. The minutes of the meeting of the Tswana School Board held on the 20th of January 1976 read the following. The circuit inspector told the board that the Secretary for Bantu Education has stated that all direct taxes paid by the black population in South Africa are being sent to various homelands for educational purposes. In urban areas, the education of black children is being paid for by the white population, that is English and Afrikaans speaking groups. Therefore, the Secretary for Bantu Education has a responsibility of satisfying the English and Afrikaans speaking people. Consequently, is the only way to satisfy both groups, the medium of instruction in all schools shall be on a 50-50 basis in future. If schools teach through a medium not prescribed by the department for a particular subject, examination questions will only be set in the medium with no option of the other language. So that is apparently the official reason why Afrikaans was brought in as a medium for teaching, but it caused tremendous unrest, and the rest is history. We know exactly what happened after that. So, as I say, it was a watershed year, and I mention it specifically because it had a big impact going forward on the brain drain in South Africa, which was unfortunate, because very soon after that, doctors started leaving. I know that half of Chris virtually applied for green cards in the States around about that time, and Chris was to lose half its brilliant staff, and these guys were irreplaceable as far as I'm concerned. And so that was another reason why I felt it was important to actually continue serving in the unit as I did, because the majority of people were trying to do anything to get out of the unit. As far as that's concerned, another little anecdote I would like to bring in is that I tried to bring in a few changes, and I must say that Western Province Command were very, very accommodating as far as that's concerned. Some of the things that perturbed me there were as follows. There were some guys who would get called up living in Port Elizabeth and far out. They'd have to stop their jobs, get on a train, travel just to do a camp. And I thought this was ridiculous, having people travel. I mean, what for? If we needed to be called up in any event, they'd have to be there in a hurry. So I made provision that these guys changed their units, that they stayed where they lived so they didn't have to travel towards us. And it made it more workable. But the other thing that as OC you get to realize that some guys are in a very compromised situation. And we spoke about compensation. One guy in particular I can mention was very, very upset. I could see that he was wasting his time there because his mind wasn't on the job. And I looked into it, and this poor guy was a mechanic, and he was the only breadwinner in the family. So when he left to come to camp, no food on the table. This was iniquitous. I wouldn't have this. So I managed to sort of make sure that he just either came in and did a morning parade and then went home, because to me, there's no point in having a guy in your unit whose mind is on having to feed his family. So, again, my time spent in the Defence Force, I only had cooperation from everybody around there, and I never ever had one moment's sort of problem as far as that was concerned. The next year we had a camp, 1977, at Red Hill, which is above Simonstown, for those of you who know the Cape. And that was an impressive camp because there we managed to achieve quite a lot, I have to say. It was a dry year, so there were not a lot of water around, a lot of snakes around there, and I managed to get hold of the chap, I forget his surname, John, somebody who was head of the world of birds, and he was an expert on snakes, and he came and gave us a lecture, because, you know, we came into contact with a lot of snakes at the time, not runkles, they're cobras and of course puff adders. And so it is important for the guys to know the difference between the various groups of snakes, which were hemolytic. There's only one is the boomslang, and the others are either tissue toxins or neurotoxins. So, and how to treat them, and recognize them and treat them was very important. And as far as training was concerned, I managed to get PT instructors from the Navy. We don't particularly like the Army, but these guys came up every morning and put our guys through the paces. And that was good. So discipline was always, I tried to keep discipline as good as possible, but be fair, you know, because after all, the officers in the unit were all doctors. Not everybody was happy. The majority of them were not happy to be there. But the troops, you know, had to be trained by somebody. So I made sure that there was always PF guys there to train them. Some bloke was seconded to us from the Army, a sergeant. I don't quite remember why, but he came in and he spent a week with us at Redial there. And this guy had seen a lot of time on the border, and but he was bang for niks nie. This guy was absolutely fearless. So the two of us were driving along. I was driving a Jeep, and the next thing I see this massive puff adder crossing the road. So he says to me, stop over here. So I said, why? So he says, ek wil daai ding hê. So I took one look at him. And this guy went into the bush there. And I know we didn't have any snake bite serum with us there at the time. And I thought to myself, this guy's insane. And I hear a noise, and he comes out holding this snake, this massive job, with his hands behind his head. The fangs are out there. And I thought, but that's the kind of guy, you know, that, I mean, there were guys who obviously had such experience, bush experience. It was just amazing to see. And these guys would organize, we had sections of guys going and doing sort of marches through Cape Point Nature Reserve. It was wonderful. And we did casevacs with choppers there as well. No pumas this time, just the alouettes. And in fact, in all our camps, we had casevac operations with the Air Force. They were very, very cooperative, and we enjoyed it. How to secure an area for choppers. We did this up near Coburg on the west coast, at Wingfield, of course, and then in the Cape Peninsula there, with the Nature Reserve and Redial, that area. So that was a very good camp, I must say. That was 1977. The rest of the time was spent in admin. I'd have to go in once a week. The secretary of the unit was always in touch with me. She could always send me stuff. So from that point of view, there was never a shortage. As I say, I had an amazing adjutant, Peter Hurley, and we managed to run the unit pretty well as far as that was concerned.
Yeah, I ask how well equipped your people were.
As far as medical equipment was, very basic. You know, at that time, we didn't have a lot of sort of out in the field ambulances per se, or in the little hospitals. No, very, very sort of basic equipment. You know, nothing to do in operation or anything like that, because this is not how we were meant to operate. We were a so-called non-conventional field ambulance unit, because what actually happened was that, excuse me, we started sending up medics one by one on a voluntary basis up to the border. So we were never going to operate as a field hospital behind the lines per se, as the old-fashioned English or or even our field hospitals used to operate. That was never going to be the idea. Medics were trained to go up and accompany sections going on patrols. And initially they were, I know one of your previous guys, Peter Lippman, I think was his name, spoke. He didn't want to become a Tampax stiffy. That made me laugh. A Tampax stiffy. Well, these Tampax stiffies, let me tell you, they may not have liked him in the beginning, but when the fecals hit the fan, if you know what I mean, they were very happy to have them around, and they became quite popular, in fact. And it was very nice to know that if you were injured, you had somebody there who could actually help you. So I actually, as I said to you before, I emphasized always how to stop hemorrhage, how to recognize hemorrhage, what to do under circumstances, and how to maintain an airway. Because without that, you can have the most sophisticated stuff in the world. But if you lose an airway and you can't look after a guy's airway, the patient's going to die. It's as simple as that. So I always go back to basics, and I did there as well. Teach the guys how to look after an airway and how to stop bleeding and basically keep a patient alive. And to this day, I honestly believe that that should be the basis of training these guys, because there's no point in, you know, later on you'll see, if we have time, and I'm in Ireland, how on a particular day, we had to look after, I was on duty in Sligo at the hospital, and there was a patient who had a brain tumor. And this patient had to be transferred across the country to a big hospital in Dublin. So somebody had to accompany the patient in an ambulance, and there was a young SHO doctor who had just passed her exams on how to look after people. You see, I mean, everybody has to go through these exams, and she had a certificate. The ink had almost not dried, and she volunteered to take this patient through. She was now fresh and new. She's just done it and successfully passed. Well, what happened? Half an hour after leaving, the patient coned, which means that the increased pressure in the brain, in the head, and it starts pushing the brain through a thing called foramen magnum, which is where your spine comes out. And the patient coned and arrested, respiratory arrest. And this girl hadn't a clue how to look after airway. We lost the patient. So I've never forgotten that, and I've always insisted that people forget about all the fancy stuff. If a patient drops in front of you, you're not meant to make a diagnosis. You're meant to just make sure the patient is breathing. And by doing this easy 3 maneuver, which is extension of the head, flexion of the neck, and jaw forward or prognatic position of the mandible, you can save lives. And that has been the basis of my training for medics in the army and for medical students and for people around me, that they know how to do that. So as far as equipment is concerned, we had basic stuff. I could have asked for stuff, but we didn't need it, because I knew that the way we were operating, anybody in a serious sort of situation gets shipped straight out to either Tygerberg or Groote Schuur.
Yeah, I want to suggest here that we make an episode exactly on how to do these things, because, you know, so we're getting older, and most of the veterans are fairly overweight and have quite a few serious medical conditions. And I also know you witnessed what happened to HP4E afterwards. We'll get to that too. But this is fascinating. And I just want to say to all of you, Dr. Erik said to me, I don't call him doctor, I don't call him colonel, I call him Erik.
Absolutely.
So that's the way it is.
No, I think that's not a bad idea of yours. Actually, it's a good way of disseminating this kind of information, because you can save a life just by doing a few simple maneuvers. You know, the point is, it always amazed me, because in the next bit that I'm going to speak about is after I left the army, but was still in Cape Town. I volunteered to do other things as well, and I can look at them as follows. One of the things is I volunteered to be on the teaching staff at Groote Schuur, and I stayed there for 14 years while I was in private anesthetic practice, because that I also believed was payback time, and I felt I owed it to the country, and also I enjoy teaching, and I thought it was important to actually put back, to give back a little bit. So for 14 years, I was a part-time consultant at Relocating. My son was growing up, and my son was a lifesaver, a lightie on the beach, and eventually became junior Springbok lifesaving captain, and he took a team over to Australia. But with this lifesaving also was an opportunity to help these guys on the various lifesaving groups around the Western Cape. So I could also impart this kind of knowledge, and I know for a fact that it helped. My own son happened to save a child's life on Mozambique beach there one day when it was also got into serious trouble, and he managed to resuscitate this child by just doing what I told him. So it helps, I remember also my eldest daughter went in the days you could still hire videos. She went into a shop in Cape Town there to hire a video, and unbeknown to her, the guy standing serving her suffered from narcolepsy. He would just fall asleep, and he was talking to her, and he just slumped down and lay on the ground there. So I said to my daughter, well, what did you do? She says, I ran out and screamed. I said, that was a great help. So I immediately, after that, brought her in, and I showed her how to look after an airway on a patient that I was giving an anesthetic to. So it's vital that we actually have a session like it, I think, and it need not be a very long session. It can be a very simple session, but there's just a handful of things people need to know. Because people in theory can learn stuff, and I saw this with the lifesavers. They all knew what to do. But on one particular day, the rubber ducky was out there in Clifton Beach in the water, and some guy was swimming out there, and the rubber ducky unfortunately got too close to this guy and cut a big hole in his leg. And of course, they brought this guy, and there was blood all over the place. And of course, all these lifesavers knew what to do, were freaking because they'd never seen anything like this. But this was a wonderful case that would show them exactly where pressure points are, how to stop bleeding. And so they didn't get that kind of experience every day, but this is the kind of stuff that I insisted on, because this is what kills people. You can bleed to death or you stop breathing. Those two things kill you very quickly. The rest of the things you can talk about. So I agree. Maybe one day we can organize something like that, Chris.
I would be most grateful, but I must ask you, Eric, these medics of yours, when they came back from the border, would they expand on their knowledge, which perhaps they picked up there dealing with real wounded soldiers?
It would have been good if they would have, but unfortunately, we never made use of this, because I left, as I say, in 1980, and I didn't have time. But that would have been an amazing thing, because Jean Duplessis, the one that you interviewed, Jean told of that episode where him and another guy at Quintin had this guy with a head injury, and they had to fix the guy up. And I really think that was absolutely unbelievably sad, because a guy who's had a head injury, deserves to be seen either by a neurosurgeon or somebody who really knows how to give an anesthetic, because it's not for amateurs. And that they were put in that position. I mean, I feel sorry for him, but there was nobody else there. That was a failing of the system, as far as I'm concerned. There are lots of doctors around, and there were possibly doctors at another place. I know I spoke to Jean about this, and I just feel that, the troops are putting their lives on the line. They need to have the best. And unfortunately, I think it was lacking, a lot of the time. But I'm not an expert on that, so I don't really want to give too much of an opinion. But I just think that anybody who's got a head injury must be seen by somebody who knows what they're doing, because expertise is out there. It's available, and it needs to be applied to people who have these severe injuries. I mean, I always think, what are you going to do? Your own son, would you be happy if somebody who's going to open a book and see, line number 1, cut here, this is not what you want for your family, and this is not what you want for your troops. You must look after the guys.
But now I have to ask you, is any other characters or people like that in with you during university or during field ambulance days.
Yeah, there's, is it okay now? Yeah. There was one guy who I really would like to mention when I was at Tuckies. I told you about the chaps who were being given scholarships by the South African Defence Force. But there were a few blokes in my class and in the year before and after me who'd actually qualified, got their wings at Donata, and were weekend flyers. And one of the guys in my class, Andre Weilbach, was one of them. And I want to mention Andre because Andre died tragically. He was flying with another guy whose name I forget, and they developed engine trouble. I forget what height. And Andre, he bailed out, and unfortunately his parachute never opened. And he went in, and it was a tremendous tragedy. He was a very nice guy. I knew him personally, and it was a great loss. So that he was one of the guys that he didn't do medicine through the Air Force, but with these guys, they would fly on weekends with 4 Squadron. I don't think anybody was that I knew at medical school was in 44 Squadron at the time. And yeah, that I think he needs to be mentioned. That was the ultimate sacrifice. Although it wasn't on the border that it happened, but it happened in Pretoria. Fortunately, I wrote my final examination in 1977 when this all happened, and I passed, and I became a specialist anesthetist. Very happy, and it was a special day in my life. I never dreamt I could get it right, but I did. I think, you know, nobody was more surprised than myself. But it just goes to show, the point I really want to make about that is I was an ordinary bloke at school, but I put my mind to it. And I realized that once you put your mind to something, you can do it. And that was the key to me, because after that, I realized that all the things I disliked at school, like history and, you know, I'm now passionate about these things. You know, all the subjects that I thought were not important in life, I'm mad about, you know. So, and I've had to use them all, you know, in anesthetics, for physics and statistics and all the stuff that I thought I'd never look at again, become part of your life. You have to know all this stuff. And I want to just try and encourage people who don't see themselves in a good light and don't have a really good opinion of themselves, start thinking better, start opening your mind, because everybody has the ability to learn. And a lot of people, I know, are told, no, you'll never do this, you'll never do that. That's nonsense. Everybody has the ability to reach for the stars. And I've always said that. And I really get upset when I see people not reach their potential. And I'll do anything in my power to help people to do that. So it's part of this whole, it's my philosophy in life, you know, is to actually help as many people as I can. And it's been an amazing thing that I've been, you know, been fortunate to be in this position to actually, you know, help people in my life from a medical point of view, and otherwise. You know, there's a saying that comes from the Talmud, the Hebrew Talmud, which says that if you save a life, you save the world. And that has always made an impression on me, you know, and I've never forgotten that. Our badge for at medical school in Pretoria, it says, you know, it's like you guys, or the chaps in the chopper squadrons, sempre in excreta, always in the, you know what. Ours was Salus Groti Suprema Lex, which means that the treatment of the sick is the highest order, as it were, to roughly. And if you never forget that, and you live your life according to those sort of principles, you know, you can get a lot of pleasure out of life. But again, I want to emphasize, people who see themselves in a bad light must absolutely forget about it. Everybody has something that they can offer the world. That is an important thing. So I've always tried to push people to be more positive and see themselves in a better light. This, of course, is going to also be tied up with, you know, the poor soldiers who suffered the post-traumatic stress disorder, who leave the Defence Force, and apparently there are thousands of these guys. And I just hope somehow we can get something going which will help these people sort of get their lives together. Unfortunately, it's been a long time and they shouldn't have suffered all this long. And the HP story that you told me, to me, is the most heartbreaking thing that I can imagine. And it should never have happened. He should have been given help, but we can talk about that later. Again, so I've now, as I say, I qualified. I get onto the specialist register, and I'm now practicing as an anesthetist, but part-time at Relocating, and I remain so for 14 years. And in this time, I'll describe all the sort of stuff that I did on a voluntary basis. So, okay, now I'm in private practice from 1980 in Cape Town. I managed to join a practice. Prior to joining this practice, actually, I tried to get into a practice in Cape Town, but I was told that they fill up, there's too many anesthetists and one thing, but that was a complete nonsense story, okay. But at the time, I was offered, I got a phone call from a guy up in Johannesburg who offered me a job there. I wasn't happy to leave Cape Town because I was in love with Cape Town. When I lived in Cape Town, the Kaap was Mos Hollands. It was a wonderful place. There was not a lot of traffic. It was just an amazing place. As I say, Chris Barnard was there. Everybody in the world wanted to come there. We met the most incredible people at Relocating. I mean, you never know who walked in, Princess Scheherazade from, the time the Shah of Iran, this was 1970, I'm talking just before he was dethroned, as it were, in 1977, thereabout. She comes in there because everybody knew Chris Barnard. Peter Sellers knew Chris Barnard. Lola Brigida knew Chris Barnard. They all wanted to be there. I mean, everybody was there. You never knew who was going to walk in through the doors of Relocating. It was fascinating. But so I decided, as I say, to give sessions a week at Relocating, and my post was in the ear, nose and throat department, and we do all sorts of operations, radical laryngectomies and all sorts of stuff. But it was a good place to actually teach, again, airway maintenance, because doing operations in this area here, often people had distorted airways, and so they needed expertise in that area. So I was very happy to do that, and so I was, as I say, spent 14 years doing that part-time. Again, once you're a doctor, always a doctor, you never know when you're going to get called, and you need to have your wits about you. So I was leaving Relocating Hospital one afternoon after one of these sessions, and I get in my car, and if Relocating or Cape Town, there's Hospital Bend, a infamous bend where a lot of accidents happen. The guys come flying around there, and so now it's home time, and there's lots of traffic leaving town, but traffic going into town was empty. So all the cars are bumper to bumper virtually as I join this traffic bumper to bumper. And I'm in the traffic slowly moving, and there's a bakkie coming down the hill from the southern suburbs towards town. And this bakkie is flying it and loses control, and the bakkie rolls in front of my eyes. I see this happening, and 3 bodies are thrown out on the road, and this bakkie ends up upside down, 3 guys in the cabin, all scrunched in. Yes, what do I do now? So I park my car on the pavement, and I get through the traffic there. I take a bag I had. Unfortunately, I carried a bag in my car with drips and intubating instruments, just in case one day. And I'm going to use it. I cross over the barrier, and all the traffic is now stopped, and there's chaos. And I see these 3 guys lying on the road there. And now I've got to do a quick triage. Who's breathing, who's not breathing. I quickly assess these 3 guys, and I see 1 guy is breathing, 2 are not. And I do what I have to do for the 1 guy. The other guy, he's not going to get it. So I go on all 4s, and I intubate him. I put a tube into him. I've got a whole, hundreds of cars watching this little scenario now. And I put a tube into him, and I start ventilating him with the ambu bag. And meantime, there's noise, there's sirens. Quickly, all of a sudden, the ambulances start arriving and helicopter pitches up, and all of a sudden the guys come there with the jaws of life, and they crank open this, they get the guys out of this cabin, and thank God the ambulance stopped there. And now we must probably 300 meters from Groote Hospital, where this all happened. And it's now out of my hands. I've done my bit, and I've managed to resuscitate these guys, fortunately, and I disappear, while all the chaos is going on. Helicopters up there and sirens going. I get back to my car, and there's a traffic cop giving me a ticket for parking my car on the pavement. Believe it or not. So I just said, listen, I just took a ticket, I tore it up, and I never heard from him since. But the point I'm trying to make is that you never know when you are called upon to do these things, But so part of my volunteering was done with the lifesaving, with the Western Province lifesaving, because my son was a lifesaver, and I put him in a canoe when he was 9 years old on the Berg River, because I'd actually taken up canoeing at that stage. I told you I'd actually started running in 1972, but by the time, when I decided to put him in the canoe, racing was a big deal. Everybody was on TV, and I didn't like the hype. You'd hear chariots of fire at every race, and everything was televised, and I wanted to get away from that because I don't really like that sort of stuff. So I looked for another sport, and I went to see the guys, and I thought canoeing is great, because canoeing on rivers, nobody's going to see you. It's wonderful, it's nature. And I got my son in a canoe at the age of 9, and we went down the Berg River, and it was fun. It was summer. Some guy showed us the tricks. But the very first time that we went down by ourselves, I hadn't realized, but the river was in flood. It was winter, and the Berg River was full. Anyway, one of my friends nearly drowned, and my son, who's 9 years old, had great balance, I could see, and he just loved it. But that was the first exposure. My son eventually became a springboard canoeist, and he represented South Africa for 14 years on the run, and he was a lifesaver, as I told you. So we did a lot of stuff together, canoeing, and not so much running, but he was into canoeing. And we went on to do a lot of races. He, as I say, was a springbuck. He won a lot of the big races in South Africa, the Fish River Canoe Marathon. He won the Bergrivier Marathon twice or thrice, I can't remember. And him and I paddled the Umkomaas together. We paddled a lot of races. We won the father and son on the Fish in 1988. And again, he asked me in 2013 to do it. And we again won it as father and son in 2013 down in the Eastern Cape. But I want to mention the being a medical officer for lifesaving. It was very important because it combined a lot of things. First of all, we used to fly on weekends with the John Rolfe helicopter, and at least 3 hours a weekend, which is wonderful. And flying in the mountains and on the beaches of the Cape in a helicopter was just simply wonderful. I love that. And so we would patrol all the beaches, all the way from the Strand, all the way up to Louwberg, various beaches, various times, and particularly with competitions and so forth. We managed to do a lot of evacuations. For instance, a young child dived into the rocks there, just near Landudno, and injured his neck. We managed to evacuate him and take him straight to Conradie, which is the hospital where they did the spinal injuries. So, we did a lot of good as far as that is concerned. We had a lot of fun as well, flying over Sandy Bay, the nudist beach. It was great. He used to give these guys something to cover themselves up with. And but it was really good. And again, I must say, had a lot of positive results from this. People knew how to save lives. And as I say, my son, in fact, saved a young child's life on the beach by just applying the extension neck, flexion of the head, and extension head, flexion neck, and the prognatic position of the mandible. And that gave me a lot of pleasure seeing that. So so that was the teaching side at Chritske, and as far as lifesaving was concerned. As far as lifesaving is concerned, just another thing. We used to have a thing, and they still have it. It's called the Cape Point Challenge, and it's paddling a surf ski all the way from Soetwater around Cape Point to Fisher. It's 65 k's in the sea. It's no joke, but to do it in those days, you had to be a lifesaver. So I managed to qualify as a lifesaver in 1988. Just made the swim by a few seconds. I had to do it, otherwise I wouldn't have been able to qualify. And my son and I actually paddled in 1988. I think I sent you a picture of that there. That we did this Cape Point Challenge. And I must tell you, we were bloody stupid because nobody in those days wore life jackets. If you wore a life jacket, you were concerned, you were thought to be a morphine, okay? And all we had was a flare tied to our pants. I had my paddle tied to our surf ski, and that was that. And we paddled around Cape Point, and it was brilliant conditions for surf skiing because we took off in the dark, like at 5 o'clock in the morning, and paddled to Cape Point where it was nice and still. And coming around the point, the southeasters started picking up, and the waves were perfect. They were just perfect, monstrous waves. And we had to come into Buffalo's Bay just to see we were still alive, and then 10-minute break, and then back out. Now, I tell you, if you paddle a surf ski out at sea, the idea was, I said to my son, now listen, and by the way, he's just about to turn 14, so he's still a lighty. And I said to him, listen, we're going to go out like about 4 k's out to sea and then turn to go straight in, because that's where the directions of the waves were. And so I looked out there back at the land, and I told her, when you're out there and there are big waves around you and you're far from the coast, it's not a nice feeling. But anyway, we had a most phenomenal ride into Fishhook. And by the time we got to the lighthouse in Simonstown, all the guys who chose to hug the coast, which was safer, they were finished by then. But we had the most brilliant ride, and I think we even came about 8th. I'm not sure, can't remember the exact position. So, you know, as I say, I had a lot of fun, but that was part of the part of my deal with lifesaving. Of course, I had to go on yearly meetings as well for SA Lifesaving, just to meet other guys and keep up to date with all this new stuff that we decided to do. Another direction of running was, or volunteering, I should say, was I took up running, as I said, to lose weight and sort of become a bit fitter. This I did when I was a GP. But by the time I got to Cape Town, I was now starting to run properly. And after my exams in 1977, you know, we really started running like 3 times a day. So it became fanatical. We were fanatical runners, I would say, which was also maybe not so good. But my first 2 oceans was in 1975 when I got there. And at the end of it, prize giving, a guy comes in there and I'd see he's completely buggered. He's lying there and he's dehydrated and he's like semi awake. So I had a drip in my car and I put it up on this guy, and I went to Chet Sainsbury, who was the organizer of the 2 oceans. And I said, Chet, listen, I just helped this guy, but I think, you know, you're running a race like this, we need to have some form of, you know, resuscitate, because something's going to happen. Somebody's going to get sick, somebody's going to get hurt, and you know, it's not good. So he said, okay, would I take it upon myself to actually start the medical tent, which I did. So I started the medical tent for the 2 oceans race, and I ran it from, as I say, 1976 when we had the first proper tent till 1999, you know, when I left Cape Town. In those years, I ran the race 17 times, and and we resuscitated lots of guys. And on average, we'd have to drip at least 200 guys in every race, but there were thousands running the race, you know. So that was pretty good experience. Tim Noakes, of course, I was very friendly with Tim and had a lot to do with him. Wrote 1 paper with him on fluid balance and so forth. And of course, to this day, there's not consensus of opinion as to how much fluid you should take when you run. So Tim and I don't always agree on certain aspects as far as that's concerned. But we gained a lot of experience at the two oceans as far as resuscitating people is concerned. So that was very, very positive from that. I unfortunately got hepatitis, and that was the reason I stopped running. This is about 1990, 92, thereabout. I had to stop running the very long runs at the time. I was really disappointed that I couldn't continue, because I have friends who've run at least 30 or 40 of them by now. But I'm actually glad in retrospect that I didn't carry on doing it, because a lot of the guys have got new hips, new ankles, new knees, and all the kind of running we did in retrospect is not good. Running is good, but all the running we did is not good. I had to have my life over again. I don't think I'd run a marathon. I would just run nothing more than half a marathon, because it's really detrimental. I ran 7 comrades, but I became disillusioned by having to get, train that hard. Training is really hard if you want to do anything well, as far as these long marathons are concerned. But in fact, I think it's really ridiculous the more I think about it in retrospect, because it's a lot of guys damage themselves and have crippled themselves, in fact. You get the odd guy who's pretty good, and has remained unscathed, but I would think that that's the minority of people. So that's my advice as far as that's concerned. But so I spent a lot of time running and canoeing and with my children, and it was wonderful. I was able to, in the Cape, give them a better kind of a life that I could as a GP, because I was always busy. I mean, I had too much to do as a GP, as I told you. I started running, I was studying, I was in the army, and a busy GP practice. It just wasn't conducive to having a decent family life. So I must say, my kids grew up on the rivers in the Cape. We used to go camping a lot. We just canoed on all the rivers, the Olifants, the Vier, the Breda, many times, and the Berg, of course, which was the big one. Comes a time that I realize I have to earn a proper living. And what I'm about to say might surprise a lot of people, but not all doctors are rich. There are doctors that are rich, clearly, and you get the guys who live well. I would actually say a lot of it is on skilt, on tick, but it's not the way I like to live. And I realized that, I was working pretty hard. I was doing as many cases a month as I could. And fortunately, I had a good job, but the pay was actually bloody awful. And I wasn't born with what I always call congenital money. I had to work for a living. And so I just felt that working as hard as I was, and sort of just moving backwards, I needed to make a decent living. All this happened around about 1994, which, as you know, was a critical time for South Africa, and everything changed. Now you might say, oh yeah, he left because of the situation. That's not the case. The reason being is I put it to my children, two of whom had grown up by this stage. If you want to stay, you stay, and they wanted to stay. So that was it. I believed in everybody has a fair chance as long as they understand the circumstances. So they left, and my wife and I and the youngest daughter left. I got a phone call one night out of the blue when I was thinking of where I was going to go, and phone call, they headhunted, they were looking for anesthetists. It was a South African group of people that my parents knew from way back in Pretoria, who had started a private hospital in Israel, and they needed an anesthetist. So I thought, well, that's a great chance for me. My wife was not happy about it. She didn't want to leave Cape Town, which is understandable. But the fact is, I could see my financial position was not going to be great if I stayed any longer. So we left, and much to my wife's dislike and so forth, and we went to Israel. Now, I can just say that the move was not for sissies, because moving there was not easy. The mentality is totally different. The people's mentality is totally different. There are, well, when I say it's different, they differ from each other because there's so many people there. There are Arabs, there are Israeli, Jewish people, there are people from all over the world. I saw lots of people from all over the world in Cape Town coming to see Chris Barnard, but here I'm now working with people really from all over the world who fled the Holocaust, who came from South America, from France, when there was trouble in the French colonies in North Africa. A lot of them went and left and came to Israel. So I was in a melting pot of people from all over the world, and it was absolutely fascinating. And I was about to learn a lot of things that I didn't know, that I thought I knew. But anyhow, so now I have to learn a new language altogether because I'm not going to be working in a situation where they speak a different language. Okay, most people can speak English, but not everybody. So I had to go to a thing called an ulpan, which is where they teach you to speak Hebrew. But my bosses wanted me to start as soon as possible. So there wasn't going to be the luxury of sitting in an ulpan for 6 months. But I needed to get registered with the medical council there. So that entailed going to a teaching hospital in Haifa, which is the Rambam, the main hospital there. And I was to be assessed. And so I was standing around there, of course, twiddling my thumbs, and I hate watching other people give anesthetics. It's the sort of thing I want to do. So I'm trained to do that. But after a month or so, I'm really getting hot full of waiting. And something happened. A guy, a plastic surgery registrar, who I became friends with, he had an uncle in the shipping business. And he needed, and he used to get doctors for these tours. The boats would sort of sail in the Mediterranean and go on tours, you see. The doctor let him down and he needed a doctor. So he said to me, he asked me, am I interested in being a ship's doctor for a month? Because I said, what a question, is the Pope Catholic? So anyhow, so I grabbed the opportunity, and in 5 seconds I was down there and I signed up on the ship, and I was ship's doctor for a month. This is my second month of being in Israel now. Still don't speak the language all that well, because it's only a month that I've been there. And we go on this cruise, and it was an amazing cruise. And fortunately, I'd been a GP for 5 years, because I tell you, I needed all that experience. It was 1,000 passengers on board, and we had all sorts of things happen. I tell you, from heart attacks to slipped discs to you name it. And I really was kept quite busy, but it was a wonderful trip. And we sailed to Greece, to the islands, Santorini, and then we came, Piraeus as well, of course, and then we sailed over to the Turkish coast, and all the way down the Turkish coast, places like Ephesus and, I'll get the name now, where we stop every night. So we'd sail at night and come into the harbor during the day. Antalya was the place's name. So we're coming to Antalya, and I just see the sunrise on this beautiful place. I mean, Turkey, the Turkish coast is absolutely outstanding. So we look at the mountains and the light catching the mountains and so forth. So the ship's docks in there, and everybody goes on board, on land, and off they go. I get a call around about midday to say that one of the passengers on the ship went into a shuk, and he slipped, and he dislocated both shoulders. Now, dislocating a shoulder is one thing, because, there's a way of reducing it. And being an anesthetist, we learn how to do these things. You can give them local blocks in the neck, but you cannot block both sides, because the nerve supply, the phrenic nerve to the diaphragm, comes from here, you see. So if you do this, the guy's not going to breathe. You can't do that. So, cut a long story short, we had to take this guy back to the ship, because the hospital there was absolutely primitive. I had a hell of a fight with the surgeon who wanted to operate on this patient. He's just eaten. And the patient's a responsibility of mine off the ship, so I refused to let him touch the patient. We took him back, and now what do I do with the patient? It's a very small theater on this hospital, on the ship. And ill-equipped to go and give an anesthetic. So I tried to, as I say, anesthetize the one side. He was in such pain with the other, but I managed to prop him up in bed, and the nurse I had was an Indian lady, terrific, also from Israel. And she was an intensive care sister, and she was my right-hand man or lady, if you like. And we looked after this guy until the ship sailed, and we got to the island of Rhodes, and we took him on into the hospital in Rhodes. And I tell you something, we had what an uphill battle. It was really primitive, but we managed to get the guy there, and they operated him and sent the patient back to Israel because of his insurance, which is fine. I had to get back to the boat because it was leaving at 3 o'clock that afternoon. And so, but there were lots of incidents on that boat that I wanted to speak about, but I won't spend too much time on that because I could write a whole book about just that trip. So I got back and I registered with the medical council, and I started my job at the hospital in Haifa. And there we worked because we had 3 theaters. There were 3 anesthetists, one Israeli guy, one American, and myself. And we would do an average of 30 operations a day, 30. So which meant that, and we had sisters looking after, and they were Russian girls, Russian sisters, they were very good. Don't forget, there was a lot of big Russian immigration into Israel after Glasnost, which allowed a lot of Jews to leave the Soviet Union at the time. So there was a very big importing of Russian doctors and nurses and scientists and physicians and mathematicians. And I tell you, it was really a tremendous input of brain that came to Israel. So these nurses would look after the patients, and the 3 anesthetists, as we would do, only 2 of us would work at any given time. Now, 2 anesthetists, 3 theaters. You know, I didn't like that idea because we had learned never to leave a patient in South Africa. You never left a patient ever alone, because if anything happened to a patient and you were out the room, you would lose your license. As simple as that. But here we had no option. So that's why we learned to do virtually a lot of the stuff under spinal anesthesia. The patients weren't asleep and they could be looked after by the nurses. And so we did a lot of open heart surgery at this hospital. Every day, virtually an open heart. We did, as I say, 30 cases a day. So it's like 15 cases each. We really worked hard. But I enjoyed it. There was tremendous turnover, but I also learned to work efficiently, you know. In South Africa, we worked hard, but nothing quite like this, because this is the first time I've worked in a private, like HMO, as it were, where time counts, you know. So there was no messing around. It had to be done, and it had to be done properly. But in this job, I managed to meet the most incredible people, actually, from all over the world, you know. And interesting things, I worked with some surgeons, and I could see, like a pediatric surgeon I used to work with, I saw the way he did pediatric hernias. And I said to him one day, I said, you know, the only other place I ever saw people doing this was at Red Cross Hospital. And he said, where do you think I learned? And it wasn't the only guy. I mean, I worked with a gynecologist who was pretty good. And he said to me, he was floundering until he went and worked at Baragwanath, which was at the time the biggest, and was probably still the biggest hospital in the world. But there, these guys got the experience that you would never, ever have got in Europe anywhere. I mean, I'm telling you. So I could spot these guys a mile off, the oaks who'd been to South Africa. And that's why I say South African training, boy, was unbelievably good. We were bloody good at I mean, we shone above the other guys. I don't say that lightly. I mean it sincerely. But despite having said that, I learned a hell of a lot in Israel. I learned to work efficiently. I learned to work with people who actually designed the operations, you know, like the laparoscopic operations, the instruments that they used. These guys actually came from France, you know, the blokes who initiated all these procedures. I actually worked with these guys. It was amazing to see. And I worked with a variety of surgeons who lived in Israel. Now, I want to dispel a couple of myths. You know, people read all sorts of nonsense about the Israel-Palestinian conflict and so forth. I'm not going to get into that because I'm not into politics. But what I will say is that some of the best surgeons I worked with in Israel were Arab guys. They were amazing. I worked with an unbelievably good cardiac surgeon in Haifa. Most probably the best surgeon I ever worked with, ever. And I worked with some good guys. It was an Arab guy by the name of Dr. Matar. He was the head of surgery at the Benoni Hospital in Haifa. And this guy, I loved working with him because he had golden hands. He would do procedures in a flash. He was just brilliant. The kind of stuff he would do was just, for sweaty palms, he would do sympathectomies, which is cutting the nerve for sweating, But so the way you do it is you stick a needle into the chest here, you deflate the lung, and you burn it. You burn the nerve. He would do this in 15 minutes. I mean, whereas to take the average guy maybe an hour or two, whatever it was, this guy knew exactly what he was doing. So I learned unbelievably with these guys, how good they were. And the best thing for an anesthetist is to work with a surgeon who knows what he's doing. If you work with a guy who's has got two left hands, reading War and Peace will be pleasant compared to working with these guys. But he was amazing. And there were some wonderful, wonderful surgeons that I worked with. So the cooperation between people there was fine. I mean, I even gave an anesthetic to the father of the Minister of Health from Gaza. Can you believe it? I mean, this would happen. He was a diabetic and we had to take his leg off. I gave an anesthetic to the mother of a high official in Jordan. There was a lot of cooperation between these various countries. You'd never read about this kind of stuff in the news, never. Despite the fact that I had nothing to do with the military, we would, in fact, treat some of the guys who came from United Nations soldiers who were injured in road mines and all that up in Lebanon. And I can recall operating on a few of these guys. One guy in particular was a Fiji soldier whose hand was blown off. His hand was outside the car when the bomb went off on the side of the road. We had to sort of do a flap to him and so forth. And very often you'd see the chopper coming down from the United Nations chopper coming down from Lebanon to Haifa, where they drop off these injured United Nations guys. So, we had a lot of cooperation, and I never ever met any, can I say, animosity between Arabs, Jews, or anybody else. I mean, it just didn't happen. And unfortunately, people don't know this. People think that everybody hates this and that Israel's an apartheid state. Nothing could be further from the truth, I can assure you. Having worked there for 8 years, I know all about it. I saw that. Where do I go next? Yeah. During the 90s, it was a tough time in Israel because there were a lot of terrorist attacks. I thought initially there was going to be peace because when I got there, there was cooperation between King Hussein and Israel. And I actually, on Independence Day, one day I saw fly over all the big cities with the Jordanian and Israeli air forces, and I think Egyptian air forces as well, all flying in unison over the various cities. And I thought to myself, well, finally peace has come to the Middle East, but it wasn't to be. And in the late 90s, there were lots of terrorist attacks, bomb blasts, buses. They went for buses. You never knew. You were quite scared to get on a bus. In Israel, you never knew what was going to happen next. That was the one form of attack. But the other thing, which was as lethal, was what they call pigua yeri, which is the Hebrew word for shooting attacks. And you'd have guys all of a sudden opening up with automatic weapons, in busy places. And I had very close contacts on a few occasions, just missed it myself. In one particular case, I went to go and visit a friend of mine who was head of the Afula hospital. He was the chief anesthetist there, because this was at a time that they had sold my hospital and I was looking for a job. And I was having difficulty actually in finding a job because a lot of the Russian doctors had come through, as I said, and they were poorly paid, but they were happy. And so therefore, the system was quite weird, that to get a job in a hospital, if they're 10 anesthetists and you have the 11th guy come in, the amount of money for the department had to be split another way. So folks were not particularly happy in bringing new guys in. But I digress a little bit. I went to visit this guy in Afula on a very nice day. And early in the morning, I left, and the sun was shining. I left Haifa, and I drove up to Afula. And the place was very quiet. And I drive past the central bus station, and I drive up to the hospital, which is on the hill. And I get to the hospital, everybody's looking at the TV, and I think, what's going on? So I ask, what happened? They said, no, there's just been a shooting incident at the central bus station in town. So I'd just driven past there. I must have missed this thing by a minute or two, where they opened fire and they injured 34 people were shot going to work. 34 people they bring into the hospital. Now, but by this stage, operating had started in the hospital at Afula, and all the theaters had a patient on the table, but they had just started. So they woke these patients up. They did a triage of 34 guys. The most serious, they brought up to theater immediately and started operating. Well, I saw what damage a Kalashnikov bullet can do to people. It's quite unbelievable. You know, a bullet entry into the thigh would sort of fold the tissues like this, you know, with the force. So you'd have multiple entry wounds and so forth. I've never seen such unbelievable triage and unbelievable cooperation as I saw in Israel. These guys are phenomenal, to say the least. And they can teach the world a thing or two about how to treat mass casualties. And they do. They send teams to, you know, to places where there are earthquakes, you know, with sniffer dogs. They're geniuses at doing this kind of stuff. They know how to organize, you know, major events very quickly. What happened in Haiti that time they had the earthquakes and the chaos there. Israel was the first guys to send a team. In 5 seconds, they were there before the Americans. They sent in teams, they're organized, they can fly anywhere in the world to do this kind of stuff. And they do. So I have great respect for the way they have advanced in medicine and their medical technology. I do. This is not even the place to speak about it. It's brilliant, the sort of stuff that they've done. But so I saw that at first hand, and that wasn't the only time I saw one of these attacks. There were lots going up to the year 2000. And we saw lots of them, and we saw lots of people losing children, and it was really very, very sad. But that's what happens. Part of my job, which I really enjoyed, which was very different to working as an anesthetist, but it was very similar to air evacuation that I'd learned with the 20 field ambulance and also with the lifesaving, was air evacuation. So now this air evacuation didn't suit everybody because it was quite sometimes hazardous, and not everybody enjoyed the sort of flying side of it. And but it appealed to me. I loved it, quite honestly. I really did. And so I used to be called in to do a lot of air evacuation, and I flew to many, many places around the world, as it were. During that period of time. I had to go and pick up patients in Germany with urosepsis. I had to pick up, pick up patients with pacemaker failure, you know, in Crete. I flew to a lot of the islands to pick up people with, you know, tourists who had retired with heart attacks and all sorts of stuff. Was par for the course. We'd pick up a lot of those guys. But two particular evacuations remain very fresh in my mind, and I think I'll start with the one that goes to Africa first. I was called one evening to say that there was an American doctor who had an emergency operation in Kenya. She was out there on a sabbatical, and she was out in the bush somewhere, and she had a ruptured cyst, and this lady doctor had this problem, and she needed to be evacuated from this hospital. It's not even a hospital. I'm not quite sure what it was. It was a little village out there in an event in Kenya. So that night I looked at CNN and I just had a look at the weather to see what kind of weather we were going to have. And it looked like there were serious thunderstorms all the way across Africa, and particularly where we were going to be going. But anyway, I didn't pay too much attention to it. And the next day at midday, I pitched up at the airport, Ben Gurion, and there was this grand old Beechcraft King Air, not a new one by any means, standing out there. And I thought, hey, what? This is a small plane to fly all the way down there. But anyway, let's have a look and see what this is all going to be. So I met the three guys, all three Israeli Air Force pilots on reserve. They were going to be the pilots. They needed three because it was going to be a long journey. And myself, there were just the four of us. So we took off more or less midday, and we headed off down to the Gulf of Aqaba. You can see brilliantly. I mean, it's really a clear day. The water was turquoise. It was absolutely marvelous. We flew all the way down to the Sinai Peninsula and then across the Red Sea, and brilliant weather. The weather was fine and everything looked just charming. And we were flying over Africa now, and looking in the distance, you could see these clouds that we know very well that appear on the northern Transvaal, more or less mid-summer day, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. You know what I'm talking about, the cumulus, those anvil type clouds that you always steer clear of. And the pilots are there and they're busy chatting. They got this map. They had a map on there. This is before all the fancy equipment came into aircraft instrumentation. So he's got a nice map on his, and the two of them are talking. The third guy sitting opposite me at the back there, and contemplating. And as we start approaching, we'd been flying for about 4 hours, I would think by now. The idea was that we were going to land in Asmara in Eritrea to refuel. Now, don't forget, at this time, Asmara and Eritrea and Ethiopia were at war. So we're now going to fly through a war zone, which I didn't think was a bright idea, but these guys apparently knew what they were doing. And it became clear that we were going to have to fly in bad weather as we approached this, because from absolute brilliant daylight, we were going to actually fly into this, and we did. And I must tell you something, I thought that was going to be my last day on Earth, because I'd never experienced anything like that in an airplane. I didn't know it was possible that an airplane would actually stick together under those conditions. But this guy was cool. He knew exactly what he was doing. We entered from bright sunlight into pitch black, and it was turbulent. It was a small plane, and we were, virtually, if I wasn't strapped down, I would have been hitting my head on the top of the cabin. This plane was being thrown around like a cork. There was lightning on the wing. It was just the most horrifying time that I'd ever experienced. But funny enough, I became extremely calm. I don't know what it is, because I thought to myself, if I'm going to die, it's going to happen. I don't think I'm going to know about it. I just all of a sudden felt very easy for whatever reason. It was an unbelievable, maybe 20 minutes. I'm not quite sure how long it took. And then all of a sudden we were descending all the time. They were trying to contact Asmara, but there was no reply all of the time. This was from about half an hour out. Nobody was actually answering whatsoever. So I didn't know whether we were going to be permitted. I didn't know we were going to get out of this cloud, but what would be. Suddenly, the pitch black became grey, and I became aware of strong rain blowing from our right side to the left, and the windscreen wipers were going, and they were buffeting all over the place. This plane was really, that it had stuck together this far was impressive. And then all of a sudden a crackle came onto the radio, and the co-pilot was busy speaking to the ground, and apparently we were given permission to land. Now I didn't know where north, south, or east or west was at this stage, but we were turning to the left all the time, and eventually I mean, the revs you could hear the engines sort of, it was a turboprop, by the way, so we could fly high, but not fast. And all of a sudden, I still saw nothing, and we're now descending, and obviously we are descending. And the next thing is, I see in the distance, you can see a few lights. And bloody amazing enough, this guy put this plane down on that runway. We must have aquaplaned because there was a hell of a lot of water. I mean, there had been a cloudburst like you can't believe. I was never so glad to get onto terra firma, I can tell you. But it was an interesting experience because we got out the plane, and all of a sudden, like after the storms on the high veld, everything's, the air is clear, it's beautiful, the light is beautiful. There was a lot of water around, and the whole Eritrean Air Force was parked on the side of the runway over there, antiquated planes, I think mainly Russian, I don't know, choppers and fighters all together there. And as I say, I could have kissed the ground. I was so happy to be done. And then we refueled and again set off. We set off over a most beautiful setting, the mountains south of Eritrea. They were absolutely wonderful. And there were these pink, large clouds, and the sun was setting. It was a memorable sight to see. And then it became dark, and we started heading off to fetch this patient in Kenya. We made contact with the airfield where the patient was, and lo and behold, what would you believe? They had no landing lights. The landing lights had packed up, and they couldn't guarantee us fuel either. So the captain said, forget this, we're flying straight into Nairobi. Now, I'd wondered why they hadn't have chartered an aircraft in any event, standard aircraft, but that wasn't my choice. So that whole flight, we landed in Nairobi, sort of close to midnight. And as prearranged, they'd arranged for the patient to be transported from this little hospital out in the sticks to be brought to Nairobi, and in the dark, a little Cessna pitched up there with the patient with a drip in her arm, holding a bottle, an African nurse, and believe it or not, a South African pilot, bush pilot. And I could speak Afrikaans to the guy. It really felt good, sort of almost ek is weer thuis. And I had a chat to him, and he had to bring the patient in, so we couldn't do that. We refueled, took about an hour, and we set off again. And we headed back up. This time the weather was great, no problems at all. And we landed at Eritrea, Asmara again, filled up, and then uneventfully we flew back with the patient. Now, you may say that things are coincidental, but I think sometimes it's a little bit more than that, because the story goes like this. The patient says to me, and she was pretty good, I have to say. She was, after having experienced an operation, she was lucky there was a Dutch surgeon working at the same place where she was, managed to operate on her and did a good job. She says to me, your accent, is that South African? So I said, yes, it is actually. She says, that's strange. She said, where did you train? I said, I trained at Fritz-Kerr, and I'm an anesthetist. She says, that's funny. Her fiance is an anesthetist who trained at Fritz-Kerr. She told me his name. I actually trained this guy. So now, I mean, is that a coincidence or is it divine intervention? I'm not sure, but anyhow. So we flew back, and that was that. That ended happily. So that was a 20-hour flight, and I must say, very memorable. But there were no problems with the patient, and she got sent back to America once she was stabilized. The other case that I want to actually bring in is that I had to fetch a patient, an English girl who had come from England to the Sinai Peninsula, Sharm el-Sheikh, to do a diving course. Apparently this is what they all do. They go there, it's goedkoop, and it's nice and goedkoop, and the weather's nice, the water's warm, and they all do their diving course there to get their certificate, and off they go. So this young girl, a beautiful girl in the mid-20s, was finished with the course, and they were cutting around, and she was in a big tube tire being towed by a boat. You know how they do that? They sort of sit in this rubber tube, and they get swung around, But unfortunately, the driver of this boat was very, very irresponsible, and he swung her into the side of a ship. And she fractured virtually every bone in her body. It was shocking. She had a fractured pelvis in 3 places. All the long bones were gone. She had 2 ribs. She didn't flail, which means that the chest wasn't collapsing in when it should be expanding out. And I had to take this girl, resuscitate her, get her right, and fly her back to England, which we did, fortunately not in the old Queen Air this time, but in the Hawker Siddeley 125, which I've sent you a picture of, okay? And that was just wonderful, flying back to that thing. But I had to make a decision whether to put an underwater drain into this lady or not. I thought she was so traumatized, I was going to give her the benefit of the doubt. And I took a set with me in case I had to do this in the plane. But fortunately, we didn't need it. And the flight was without incident. And we landed at Luton Airport. The plane needed to stay there for a week or so for being serviced. So we were going to fly back with British Airways. And it was a Sunday afternoon. We took the patient in. So again, the N25, I think, is one of those circular roads in London, which is bumper to bumper. I thought, no, I can't sit in an ambulance again for another, I don't know how long. But fortunately, we had police protection, and they got us to the new St. George's Hospital in double quick time, and I handed the patient over to them there. So that was quite an experience. And as I say, I had to pick up a lot of patients around the place, but I think I'll leave it at that as far as those stories are concerned. Unfortunately, at some time, they decided to sell our hospital, and I found myself needing a job again. It sounds ridiculous. I mean, there is such a shortage of anesthetists in the world, and yet I can't find a job. So I looked for work, and I looked on the net, and I saw that they were advertising jobs in Ireland. And so I put in an application, and I managed to get a job in a place called Ennis. The guys phoned back in a very short time, and they said, yeah, sure, by all means, you know. So I applied for a job, and I got this job, and I went over to Ireland, and this is in the beginning of 2000. In fact, just a little bit of time before the Twin Towers were attacked, because I remember that very, very well indeed, standing in the doctor's room, and I just thought, I saw this airplane flying to the building. I thought the guys had a movie on, but I didn't know what it was. I couldn't figure it out, but that was the time that I went there. And so I got a job as a consultant, but in a private, a consultant in a public hospital in Ennis General, and it was very nice indeed. There were just 2 doctors who were working their butts off, and they needed help, and so I got to work with these guys, and we really hit it off. They were more or less my age, and we had a great time. I settled down there, got into the specialist register, and funny enough, I never had to write another exam overseas. My South African qualifications were really well thought of and accepted everywhere. So I got into the specialist register in Ireland, as well as Israel, of course, and later on you'll hear in Sweden. But it was very interesting indeed, because having had the experience of working in the Middle East and working in Africa, you know, each of these various countries and areas, terrains, have their own sort of special medical conditions, strangely enough. So I started seeing stuff for the first time, like Mediterranean fever, pain, rash, and joints, you know, that was seen often in patients in the Middle East, but in Ireland, they had their own set of sort of problems, like a very high incidence of cystic fibrosis and celiac disease. and galactosemia and so forth, and the hereditary hemochromatosis in Ireland. A lot of people it's in their families. So one sees a lot of that. Something that you don't see there is porphyria. I don't know if you're aware of it, but porphyria is a blood condition, also congenital, seen in South Africa a lot. So as anesthetists, we were very, very aware of porphyria, but they weren't, hardly heard about it in Ireland. But it became important because people from Africa were immigrating to these countries. And as a lot of people from Nigeria were coming in and so forth. So we started seeing diseases like in sub-Saharan Africa, there's a lot of sickle cell anemia. You wouldn't sort of see this. And, so if you have a black patient on the table, for instance, from Nigeria, and he's coughing, the guys were not too au fait with the fact that he could have tuberculosis. And I cancel a lot of cases there with guys who had tuberculosis and were unseen. So, the dynamics and the demography is changing all the time. So one saw a lot of that there, and, tuberculosis started coming in. All these diseases were sort of rife in Ireland and in Europe and in Scandinavia many, many years ago, but they've kind of cleared out. So it wasn't a problem anymore, but they started coming back. And so, I was open vocal as far as that was concerned to sort of see what was going on there.
Eric, I have to ask you here, there's something been bothering me. Yeah. I was thinking all the time. What happened to the guy who swallowed the nails? How do you get that out?
That's easy. No, he needs a laparotomy. You see, I don't even know if those nails were causing his problem, because what happens is they went into his stomach, and of course they're quite sharp points. So it will eventually irritate the stomach wall itself and cause fibrosis and so forth, and maybe even penetrate. He's, and if it perforate, and then of course he can get peritonitis, and then he needs an operation. But sometimes if a guy has a thing, they just either leave it, but these were such bloody large nails. I mean, I'd never seen anything like this in my life before. So what do we do is, I don't know what the outcome with him was, but, the fact is he could have had if there was no perforation, he could have had a straightforward laparotomy. They could have removed it. That's not a problem.
Some time ago, we broadcasted HP Ferreira. Now, HP Ferreira, for you people who haven't seen it, please go and look. I'll put the link in the description. He was involved in Ops Skeptic, and that's where rattles attacked smoke shell base, and the rattles got shot out. And poor HP was a driver in one of the rattles, I believe a command rattle actually, on a Paul Low, whose episode is just the day before the one of HP. So go and look at it if you people can. And he got shot by a 14.5 millimeter anti-aircraft gun. Now that's a huge caliber, but that's bigger than a 5.0 Browning, by the way. It's a horrible thing. And it seems that since then he had 96 operations, which I suppose 96 times under narcosis, which I can't think is good for you. So I want to ask your opinion about that. And now the wound, I understand, is still open, which I also don't understand. And it's as big as my fist. It looks most dreadful. So I have to ask you, Eric, as a medical man, as a professional with so many decades of experience, what do you think of a HP Ferreira case?
Well, Chris, let me tell you quite honestly, I'm horrified. I'm horrified because my heart bleeds for HP. I think that the situation he's had to endure for 40 years is actually unacceptable. It's unacceptable to me. I think he's one outstanding person for a man who's gone through as much agony and hardship that he's gone through, and still has goodwill to want to help others. Shows you what an absolute, unbelievable, wonderful man this guy is. And he's supported by an amazing wife, and with his Christian belief. And may God help the man. But I think the situation, he should never have ever ended up in a situation like this, because it is, from my way of thinking, it's unacceptable. It should never have happened. Here's a guy with a chronic serious injuries lasting 40 years. He's lost his job. I don't know if he's had a job, but he's had so many hardships to endure. And I honestly feel that he was shortchanged by the government. You know, he was prepared to stand up and at thy call we shall not falter, firm and steadfast we shall stand. He did that, as did many others. But when it came for payback time, it never happened. And he shouldn't be in the situation where people are having to scrounge and look for people to help him. This should have been government policy. And at this stage, I can just talk about my experience that I had in Israel. I was never in the military there because at my age, you know, nobody goes into the military at that stage, but I had experience and I'd met people. How did I meet these guys? It's quite interesting. One of the guys that I met, I don't think I'll mention his name, but the fact of the matter is he was a Mirage pilot during the Six-Day War. And that episode in itself is just unbelievable. And he's written, he can follow, there are books written about it, but I don't want to go into that. But the fact of the matter is he was again involved in the 1973 war, the so-called Yom Kippur War, and he was shot down in a Phantom over Egypt by a SAM missile. And he was treated well. He was actually initially treated there by the doctors with respect, and they did a good job. They looked after him, but he ended up with a problem elbow, so he wasn't able to fit into the cockpit so well. But I got to meet this guy because through another friend of mine in South Africa, who at this stage I can bring it in because to show you how this all ties up. When I lived in Benoni, and I was the general practitioner and medical officer of Benoni Commando, my neighbor was a great guy. Rod Lagerson is his name. And Rod was a flying instructor at Black Band Benoni Flying Club initially. That's when I met him. And I used to go flying with him. It was wonderful. He would do things over the general flying area over Heidelberg. And, it's interesting to experience spins and all that kind of stuff. So I really enjoyed it. And Rod was an amazing good friend and a brilliant pilot. He then moved on and became a pilot for E.L. Bateman, the construction people. And E.L. Bateman, he used to fly their helicopter, their Bell Jet Ranger. And E.L. Bateman set up a factory in Israel. And Rod had to go over there to find a pilot suitable enough to fly their plane for them in Israel, because you know, it's a very small area and it's military controlled, and so therefore you can't fly around there if you don't understand the language or the the setup. So he went over there and he found this guy, and he became very good friends with this bloke. I'll come back to the bloke shortly, but I'd just like to tell you about Rod Lagerson, because Rod Lagerson, as I say, who eventually became chief pilot for Com Air, was my neighbor. And he ended up with a lot of flying hours, 23,000 flying hours. But at the time we lived in Benoni, he was, as I say, an instructor locally. He then part-time joined the commandos, and he would be attached to standby, as you can say, to transport command. So he flew the Shriek Commando, which is a turbo prop aircraft, and had long distance range, and they could fly up to the border across Botswana because of the way that, you know, this plane operated. And so Rod had a lot of flying experience, flying people into places like Makacha and Rundu, and all over the border, in fact. He flew 600 hours with the commandos, and was a very valuable member. A little anecdote as far as Rod's concerned. Rod's father was the navigator on the second Comet that broke up over the Mediterranean. Now, I don't know if people have any memory of this, but the Comet airliner initially was leased to South African Airways, this particular one. And on a flight from Rome, I think it was, it broke up over the Mediterranean, and Rod lost his father tragically. So Rod, when he was in Israel, he met this guy that I've been describing. He was shot down over Egypt, and subsequently I met him and became very good friends with him. And the reason I bring this up is because I did meet many people in Israel. Virtually everybody's been a soldier there. Virtually everybody's lost somebody in the family. And on Memorial Day every year, it's the sirens go and the whole country comes to a standstill, and everybody stands silent for 2 minutes, whether it's in the street or anywhere. Israel stops for 2 minutes. But the reason I bring this up is because Israel appreciates their soldiers, and any soldier that is injured seriously or not so seriously is looked after by the army. The army never lets them down. They will always look after you. They will always go to the ends of the earth to bring you back. And one of the guys I was friendly with happened to have been paralyzed through an accident in the army. And as an example, this guy is given a car, a SUV, fitted out to take his wheelchair. He's given a house, and he's on a pension for life. That's the sort of things that should be done. And honestly, it's one of the phases that really upsets me about what happened in South Africa, because a lot of guys got called up, they went, they did their duty, but their country didn't do their duty to these guys. So therefore, if we mention people like HP, I just think that, having to depend just on handouts is degrading for the man and his wife. It's degrading for anybody who knows him. And I agree, there's something should be done for people like him, for people who are suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. And there are thousands of these guys who want to get on with their lives. And I think it's something we should all think of and somehow direct our energies to improving the situation of these people, if it can be done somehow. I can just tell you that the work in Ireland was very interesting. I told you, we met people with different sort of conditions and so forth. I was also involved in the setup there, which was interesting. It is for the whole United Kingdom and Ireland. It was the way they dealt with organ transplantation. There is a central setup. I'm not sure where they're based in England, but it's in England as far as I know, where they control any heart transplants or whatever it is that any organ transplantation anywhere in the UK and Ireland, they coordinate the whole thing. And I was involved when I worked in Ireland with one or two of these cases, and I must say it's pretty tragic. I could just briefly tell you of one of the cases. There was a young man of 37 who had all of a sudden a stroke, had a brain bleed, and was considered brain dead by all criteria used at the time. And it was a question of what one does with this donor. Permission was asked from the family whether they could be used as a donor, and permission was granted. I must say it was a hell of a sad to see this, because he was leaving a young family behind. But the family were okay with it, realizing that he was brain dead. All the tests that they used were positive, and so it was decided. So the team gathered on the west of Ireland, being not too far from Shannon Airport, and the team arrived ready to do the harvesting of the organs. And it's my job to look after the donor. And so the team flew in, and they took the organs, and strange enough, everything was going to be used. The patients were prepared for organ donation around the UK. I think the lungs were going to go to somebody in Newcastle, the heart was going to somebody in London, the eyes were going to, the corneas were going to somebody else somewhere. But it was brilliantly organized, and I must say I was thoroughly impressed by it. And I did this on 2 occasions, actually, that I had to deal with patients going for organ donation. It was very interesting indeed. But living on the west of Ireland, where I was I started working initially at the NS General Hospital there. As I said, we saw patients coming in from all parts of the world, immigrants all moving into Europe. Ireland in particular was a favorite of theirs. So we would see patients with the most foreign kind of conditions, as I say, the Mediterranean fevers, the sickle cell anemias and so forth, and tuberculosis. Tuberculosis was, if you weren't looking for it, it's like a snake in the grass, it would just get you. And so I had a lot to deal with these patients, but I also had to deal with transporting patients. Ireland is not a big place, so not every place has a hospital big enough to sort of actually cope with every kind of condition. But I had to transport a lot of patients in Ireland to bigger centres. One of the cases, for instance, this is the sort of thing I do. A 2-year-old is sitting on his dad's tractor as he's ploughing the ground, and he fell off his tractor, and his father rode over his head. Fortunately for the child, this sounds ridiculous, the child was pushed into the soft ground. The earth was soft, nice and soft, not hard like you'd expect in the Karoo or something like it. This is Ireland, nice and soft, where there's peat and bog around and so forth. And miraculously, the child survives, but he has facial fractures, of course, which you could expect. So they send the child in, and I'm intubate the child, manage to get a tube in and breathe, ventilate the child. And now we have to take the child from Ennis, where this happened, which is between Galway and Limerick, in an ambulance, 3 hours more or less down to Cork, which is on the south of Ireland. Ventilating a small child in the back of an ambulance it wasn't fun. It was pretty difficult. And so I managed to get the child down there, kept the child's pupils still responding, which means that the brain was getting oxygen. But the child was okay. The child survived and happily saw his survived his second birthday. And but some children were not so fortunate. And there was a child sitting in the back of its mother's car in a small chair. And as often happens on Irish country roads, Farmer Jones is driving his tractor and he was signaling, but the signal light didn't work, and the mother rode into the back of this tractor. The poor child hit the top of the head, hit the top of the car, and the child had severe brain injuries. Took the child again down to Cork, but this time it didn't manage to survive. I mean, it's the kind of thing you'd see. So, traveling with children on ventilators in the back of an ambulance is not fun, and it's pretty difficult. I found myself actually in different situations when I got to Ireland. I'd go for a hike. I wanted to go to Dingle Peninsula, for a hike, and I'm standing at the airport. I'm standing at the station in Limerick, minding my business, waiting for the bus. And all of a sudden they call, is there a doctor around? And I see there's a bloke lying on the concourse in the middle of the station there, nicely dressed. He just got off a train from Dublin. He'd come in from England to see family, and he must have had a heart attack there and then. So I get to the guy, and somehow I give him what I told you about the airway maintenance, get his airway going, and I managed to put a tube into him because a nurse walks by and she brings with her endotracheal tube and all that. How that got there, I don't know, but it did. And we managed to get the guy into ambulance and taken off to Limerick Hospital and treated further. So, as I say, you never know when it's going to happen, but it happens when you least expect it. These kind of things did happen. Transporting patients became the name of the game, but I say I didn't enjoy sitting in the back of an ambulance for 3 hours. It's quite a nauseating experience, actually, especially when everything's bumping around and you are trying to desperately keep an airway patent in a small child. But you learn. So there were all these sort of challenges, but fortunate enough, the time came when I did more permanent work in Ireland, and I started working with an orthopedic surgeon, the chief of orthopedics, actually in in Galway University Hospital. He was a marvelous guy with tremendous experience. And we did a lot of back operations and spinal operation in particular. He had trained in America, and I loved working with him. And so I gained a lot of experience by this stage and enjoyed my time in Ireland. But there was a time coming where I was going to have to retire from doing public work. Although I was in the private sector, we used to do public work outside called National Treatment Purchase Fund, NTPF, where you could do private hospital cases outside mixed with private. But because I had reached the age of 65, I was no longer allowed to do these cases, so I could only work outside in private. But of course, a lot of these NTPF cases were still on the list, so it became unmanageable. They'd have to get somebody else to come and do the case. It's really ridiculous that you've got to stop working at 65. So the fact is, that is what made me decide that, you know, as much as I like working, and I loved working in Ireland, I have to say, but I had to give up because it became untenable. It's just unmanageable working like that. So that was how I got to leave Ireland, which I left very reluctantly. I had to leave because of the work situation. I was happily ensconced in private. I could have carried on working. I loved it. But this whole NTPF nonsense wrecked my sort of ability to work there, which was unfortunate because I had a great time and I was appreciated and I appreciated the people. So I can only have good things to say about Ireland. And we had a wonderful amount of what they don't call it fun, they call it crack. You know, you have crack in Ireland. So saw a lot, traveled a lot there and did a lot of things and enjoyed life. And left there to come and work in Sweden, where I was offered a job because my wife, as I say, was trained as a nurse in America, but also in Ireland and in Sweden. She had to do a license in all three places. So I was about to start working in in Sweden, I should say. But things were a little bit different here. First of all, I had to learn another language. So it's not just English, Afrikaans, Hebrew. Now it's Swedish. So you think, oh, this is what I wanted to say. You've got to approach life with an open mind. Never ever think that you've learned everything you can. Your brain can absorb a lot of stuff. And even at my age, it's possible to do this. So I came here, but I didn't enjoy the situation here because a lot of the anesthetics are given by nurse anesthetists. They're very good. But I was grown up never ever to leave a patient. And I felt always very uneasy about having to sit in the tea room waiting to be called, because the truth of the matter is that accidents happen in anesthesia and not just suddenly, they build up. They're surreptitious the way they happen. And if you haven't got your finger on the pulse and you're not watching what's happening all the time, you're going to get caught. It's going to come and bite you on the bum. So you've got to watch the way things develop. And as such, I wasn't happy to sort of, just be called, as I say. So I, in fact, decided to say, call it a day. Most reluctantly, I thought to myself, I can't believe after all these years, like almost 50 years, in medicine, 45 or 6 years doing anesthetics. I accumulated about 86,000 anesthetics, by the way, over the years, over in all the countries, all together. My logbook shows close to that number. I just was really unhappy to give up, but I thought, you know what? I've got this far unscathed. I must count my blessings because you never know. The thing about anesthesia is like flying. You're going to be judged on your next case. You can have the most perfect career, but if you cock up on your next case, that's the one that's going to do you. And so I thought, well, I've got this far, I might as well. And over time, I've got over not working. I still kept up to date with what's going on. I've developed other interests in medicine, in particular electrophysiology, cardiac. It's the cardiac physiology, which has changed dramatically since the days I worked with Chris Barnard and those guys. It's a whole new science and it is totally advanced, and I find it absolutely absorbing to see what they can do now with pacemakers and so forth, and wireless pacemakers, and it's become an incredibly interesting science. So that's where I am at the moment as far as medicine is concerned. And where to from here? The point of the matter is that I'd like to just sort of, at this stage, before we get on to, what should be done for guys like HP. The thing is, so I'm retired, but you're never off the hook as a doctor. A doctor, you're always a doctor, and you can be called at any time to do anything. And it's amazing because often here I have to sort of treat guys around the corner, although the medical system here in Sweden where I live is superb. It's phenomenal. The guys are really on the ball. But there are old people who live around me because I live out in the sticks, and they don't speak English. So it's all Swedish. So I have to help these guys. And if I can, always, like I'm going to see one of the old farmers. I was walking my dog one day and I see him collapse in the field. He's just standing there. He loses his balance. So I run to him, and I can give first aid to these guys. It's very nice indeed. But the thing is, you're never really, as a doctor, off duty. And I'd just like to kind of finally sort of mention a couple of cases that have happened to me. Very often with flying, I've noticed, is there a doctor on board? They will ask you. Now, generally, you don't want to stand up like an idiot and say, yeah, I'm a doctor and so forth. But it has often happened that I've had to treat people on aircraft. And the one happened the last time I flew to South Africa, in fact, on the way back. But initially, I had once treated a woman in a diabetic coma on the plane. I've often had to give advice with small sort of stuff. But flying back with British Airways to Heathrow from South Africa, from Cape Town 2 years ago, I was minding my business, and sort of more or less midnight, one of the staff came and tapped me on the shoulder. I don't sleep well on a plane, but I was like kind of resting, and said, listen, are you a doctor, a medical doctor? I said, yeah. And he said, look, there's only another doctor on the plane, but he's a doctor of engineering, so he's not much help to us. But would you be prepared just to help us, because there's a guy in need here? So I said, by all means. So they took me to the galley there, and they brought this patient to me. He was a young Irish guy, strange enough, who had been on holiday in South Africa and was returning back to Ireland via Heathrow. And he had acute pain in his scrotum, his testicle. Now that can be a very serious thing. So there's quite a big, large diagnosis that you have to go through. There's many things that can be. So unfortunately, I'd been a GP, as I said, for 5 years, so I was able to sort of be sensible about this and have a look at it. Now I examined the guy, and it looked to me, the most serious of all is a thing called a torsion of the testis, where the testicle turns on its own blood supply and starts becoming gangrenous if you leave it. Of course, there's hernias that can be reduced, that they don't get reduced, and there's lots of things happening. There's varicocele on the left-hand side, and there's hematocele, and there's all kinds of things that can actually be tumors. You go through the whole lot. But the most critical of all is this thing called a torsion of the testis, because if you don't deal with it and you don't undo the sort of obstruction, he's going to lose his testicle, you see. So now imagine the scenario. We're flying over midnight, we're flying over Central Africa somewhere, and they ask me if I'll have a look at this guy. So I have a look at him, and I have to make a decision as to what's wrong with this guy. And he tells me the captain wants to speak to me. So the captain actually comes down, and he said, look, this is the story, what's happening with this guy. So I said to him, look, timing with this guy is critical. I think this guy's got a torsion of the testis. And if you leave a torsion beyond 6 hours, it may be from 6 to 12 hours post when the torsion thing begins, you're going to lose this testicle, So and that's just the way it is. So he said, do you want me to divert the aeroplane? So I thought, what? This is now on my shoulders. I've got to figure out what we're going to do. So I said to him, look, in all seriousness, I went and took a history from this guy. His problem started earlier. it didn't just start at 6 o'clock that afternoon or that evening when we took off to fly back to England. On questioning, it started much earlier that there was pain. So it meant that we were possibly beyond the 12 hours, which means that doing any diversion is not going to help at that stage because the guy's going to lose it. So he said, do me a favor, the captain, will you, they wanted to see my credentials, of course, first of all. So I had to show the guys, you know, medical degrees. Fortunately, I had a lot of stuff on my phone. These iPhones are phenomenal. There's textbooks of medicine. There's all sorts of stuff that I keep on the thing. But anyhow, so we go up there and he says, listen, what I'm going to do is I'm getting through to Tucson, Arizona, where there is a center that connects to all aircraft flying around the world. I didn't know about this at all. And I'll give you earphones and we'll link up, you and me will speak to them in Tucson, Arizona. And you will tell them what you found and we'll discuss the thing together. So I thought this was bloody amazing. So there I'm sitting between these guys, pitch black outside, thinking to myself, I hope these guys know where they're going, but it's black and we're flying over the Sahara somewhere there. And so they get through to Tucson and I'll explain to the guys I tell them what I find clinically and that I think that we're beyond the 12 hours, you know, and so forth. And anyway, they agreed with me. They said, okay, we think you're right and so forth. So do we, you know, what do we do? They leave it to me. And I thought, no, I don't want these guys to land in North Africa because by the time we get fixed up in the hospital, I have no idea how good the standard of medicine would be there. I said it will be far safer just flying straight home. I'll give the guy morphine, which I did. I looked after him there. And we were the first landed at Heathrow. We were the first guys to leave the plane, which is one advantage. I didn't have to stand in queues. Got this guy off, an ambulance was waiting for him, and then they took him away. Now, I never ever found out the outcome, but I've no doubt that he must have lost the testicle. The fact of the matter is just to make sure that there was nothing else going on. I have to give BA all the credit because by the time I transferred from there to Oslo, where I was flying, the guys on the plane on that second flight knew all about it and they thanked me for being such a good guy. And they actually gave me a free ticket to fly somewhere, but it never happened because of COVID. So I never took them up on it. So the fact is you're never, ever really off the hook. And as a result, I always keep up to date as best as I can. My bookshelf here is full of stuff and I'm forever reading. And I love medicine. I love, you know, anesthesia, the life that I've led and been given to sort of the absolute privilege that I was given to have qualified as a doctor in South Africa, to qualify as an anesthetist in South Africa. These are gifts that are beyond worth. And all I can say is I'm very grateful. And so I've made it my life's sort of duty to always help as many people as I can because it's enjoyable. I always remember, if you help save one life, you save the world. And that's been the philosophy I've lived by. So I don't know, Chris, that's about it, I think, up to date. I mean, there's lots of other stuff I can say. I learned to play the fiddle when I was in Ireland. You know, it's like I play with a group here. We play Swedish folk music, and it's great. And life has been good to me, I must say. And but I'm being very grateful. So if I can be of help to guys like HP, then we can put our heads together and somehow try and work out something because he deserves a lot more than he's got.